Cool. So welcome to this discussion. So John and I are here with Malcolm and Simone, who I'm not allowed to introduce themselves. Although I'm actually, to be honest, I'm sure a lot of people watching won't need you to introduce yourselves. But if you want to just take the floor.
So we are Malcolm and Simone Collins on YouTube, like in the podcasting world, I guess. We run Basecamp. We've written 5 books that we're probably better known for, all of which have been bestsellers. The most recent topped the Wall Street Journal non-fiction list this year in the US. We run the Pronatalist Foundation, and that is why we are here, where the potential point of contention is. Although I imagine it's actually kind of less of a point of contention than people might imagine. Is there anything else we do, Simone?
No, not that we should mention.
Oh, you're pregnant right now. That's probably right.
Yeah, we have kid number 4 on the way.
Not frequently on this show.
Yeah.
And so we thought a great way to start would be for just outlining the positions which we would defend. I'll love you guys starting. So in the world of antinatalism, there's environmentalist antinatalism, negative utilitarian antinatalism, ethilism, David Benatar style antinatalism. Where are you guys, and what is your long-term goals for our species?
Do you want to go first?
I'll go first, yeah. So I'm broadly, I'd say, on the negative utilitarian kind of end, in the fact that I think that we should value suffering more than pleasure, but not to the point where that pleasure doesn't mean anything. My broad reasons for, I guess you could call me like a soft antinatalist as well. I'm not one of those people that says there would never be a reason to bring a sentient being into existence.
Well, that's much harder to argue against you.
I'm just a fence sitter, really. Just worm my way out of being thin and trying to corner. So broadly, 3 main reasons for me thinking it's a bad idea to create sentient beings. The harm that we could do to those sentient beings by bringing them into existence, the harm they're likely to experience, the harm that they are likely to cause to other sentient beings as well, and then the opportunity cost of doing good in the world, specifically for having children, like you could be donating the money, that kind of thing. So those are my 3 broad reasons for being antinatalist.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, mine are very similar to John's. I would definitely say that I think when I have discussions on this topic, I always just, whenever we're talking about it, the thing it always comes down to is David Benatar's asymmetry, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But I would definitely say that that's not the only thing that I place significance on. Like John, for me, when I think about any ethical situation, my primary drive is wanting to reduce suffering. It's not the only one, but it is the primary one. So yeah, I thought mentioning the asymmetry is the only sort of difference.
Yeah, so one area where I'd love to clarify with you guys, because within the negative utilitarian antinatalist branch, there are sort of 2 branches, like the ethilist, which would be the hardest version, which I know you wouldn't fall into. But I guess what I'd ask here is, when do you think an entity gains sort of a right to exist? Or do you think that no entity really has a right to exist, no matter how long it's existed already? I guess what I'm asking here is, some negative utilitarians do not think there is any moral harm from killing somebody who has no contacts, and if you kill them painlessly. Are you in that camp?
No. So
okay, yeah.
I do think that death is a harm. Okay. I'm not I think it's the Epicurean argument that if you shot someone in the back of the head and they never found out, you wouldn't harm them. I do think that death is a harm, which is why I said, in terms of the harms they would do rather than just suffering, I think that you have suffering as one of them, but then death being quite a significant harm as well.
Yeah. So when do you think, and this is something that I always, when do you think that it first becomes a harm to kill a human? Is it at the moment of conception? Is it after birth? Is it if I prevented conception right before conception, would that be harm? When does harm start to matter, or death start to matter?
I mean,
so for me, it would be when sentience arises, and I would define sentience as just being able to have a subjective experience where you value certain things and disvalue or want to avoid other things, really.
So a living entity that loses sentience, deep sleep, or when you're under deep sedation, does it, if you killed it then, why would that be a bad thing?
Great
Do you wanna
question.
go?
I think that the interests view of death is the one that I subscribe to.
Explain. I'm not familiar.
Yeah.
Sure. So basically, an interests view against harm is that once you've come into existence and have a conscious experience, you have certain interests that arise from the fact that you are sentient.
Oh.
And one of them would be an interest in continuing living. And that would still maintain if you were asleep, if you were in a coma, for example. So I guess the view that I have is of once sentient beings are the ones that I think, or a being that has had sentience and does have the capacity for that sentience to continue.
So can you break this down a bit more? I guess I just don't understand it. Like, this doesn't seem intuitive to me. So when a being exists, like as soon as it achieves sentience for the first time, then it gains status, like a special status among all entities, which is interests. And it is applied all of the interests it would have at any point of its life. So even like when it's first...
I'm not so sure about that. And this is where it gets tricky, because I think that one of the things I'm interested in is, in terms of like I'm morally interested in, is the capacity for experiencing pleasure and also experiencing pain as well. And I think those capacities differ amongst sentient beings. And this is where it gets quite tricky, because it probably does differ within the human species as well. I don't think this is necessarily something legally that we should do. But I think you could definitely give an example of someone who maybe they are sentient, but they have much less capacity for suffering, much less capacity for experiencing pleasure as well. And arguably less of an interest in continuing living. You could make the argument that that person has less moral value, therefore, than someone who has those things in greater capacity. And I think this is most relevant when it comes to like moral value between species. Like, I think that, from my best estimate, like a dog has less to lose than a person, so it'll have less moral value. A mosquito, again, we really don't know this stuff, but I'm guessing that a mosquito has less to lose than a dog, and therefore has less moral value. So I guess in the case of like a human being, if we're talking about like abortion and stuff like that, I think, or at least like when a being first has that morals, it would be some point before birth, but some point after conception. And the fact that I don't know where.
Just fun fact that at one point, after a certain point in the womb, scientific researchers have at one point done really detailed ultrasounds of babies' faces, while mothers consume, without actually tasting, so like through a tube, very bitter and very sweet foods. And the babies actually like show signs of like smiling and frowning, like when they get the bitter stuff. Yeah, so like it is really interesting.
Definitely. Have you read Better Never to Have Been, by the way? Because he has quite a lot. So Benatar looks into
that book. I've gone over it, but I haven't read it.
It's not the most important part for the antinatalist conversation, but he does talk about like fetal pain. And his argument is that it's slightly later. I've really looked into this, and it seems to be the earliest that people argue some sort of sentient interest is around 12 weeks, and the latest that people argue, I think Benatar's is like 26 weeks. It's around 24.
That makes sense.
From my personal perspective, I mean, it's somewhere within from a minute after conception to 40 weeks of giving birth.
So I want to continue with this interest identifier. So I'm just trying to understand like exactly how this works, because this is the thing upon which human life moral weight works within this moral philosophy. So it's important that I understand exactly how it works. It sounds like I'm just going to try to intuit how it's supposed to work. So as a person ages, their interest modifier is sort of weighted by their maximum sentience that they achieve in life. And then after they have achieved that maximum level of sentience, because, you know, as a person gets like super old age, they begin to, you know, wane in mental capacity. Does this sort of interest meter then decline as their mental capacity declines, but stays sort of steady while they sleep? So like they go to sleep and it's continuing to move up because they're continuing to move up, but then it declines when they hit.
That's a great question. I think, so is it in terms of like their interest is going down as their capacity for experiencing pleasure and pain goes down?
Yeah. Well, so this is actually an interesting point. I guess I would argue, and you can tell me if this is different from your worldview, I sort of intuit what you're saying is this interest meter is tied to the like intelligent understanding of pleasure and pain, whereas we would argue that some species that are non-human feel pleasure and pain at a lot higher level than humans are capable of feeling it. A good example here would be a dog.
Yeah.
I think dogs feel much more love and pleasure than humans do because they were selectively bred to feel those things.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think dolphins as well, like orcas experience like intense emotional states, actually more than people do as well.
So do you judge an entity's sort of interest meter by the intensity or amount of pain it feels, or the sentience layer that pain is filtering through?
That's a great question. I think when you're talking about the intelligent, I guess on some level, and again, I really don't know in terms of and I'm not sure that anyone really knows the extent to which different species, for example, experience this stuff. In terms of the intelligence around it, I guess on some level, I've always kind of equated intelligence with more to lose, if that makes sense. Because I think that humans can experience things like existential dread, like maybe different kinds of suffering, but also different kinds of pleasure, like long-term goals, for example, that maybe like non-humans don't experience to the same extent. So that's a good question. I don't really know, and I think, fortunately, I think it is key to this conversation. I guess I've always kind of assumed that a sentient being who is intelligent, because like a calculator is very intelligent with maths, but doesn't appear to be sentient. I've kind of always assumed that they would have more to lose, but then that might not be the case.
It's already immediately clear to me sort of where our difference in logic lies, so I can sort of outline it and
maybe now's a good time to outline pronatalism.
Well, yes, and I can do that as well.
Perfect.
But I think that this also will help us sort of frame this, because unfortunately it's a point where there isn't like a logical reason why one answer is true and the other answer isn't. We sort of have an interest meter as well, but we don't assign it to an entity at a point. Like after it doesn't gain its interest meter after it reaches a certain level of sentience, and then that interest meter is modified by its highest potential sentience.
Yes.
We sort of look at the future as potential time streams, and every interest meter that could, like all potential entities have an interest meter, and their interest meter is determined by their level of sentience. Now, this is where we differ a bit as well, which we can get into, is we assign the value of life to a thing, not based on like the intensity of pleasure and pain it will feel, but the intensity of agency that it has, which we sort of see as its sentience level. And here we would define agency. I can define it in terms of a non-human entity, right? So suppose you built a paperclip maximizer. People who are familiar with AI devices, familiar, it's an AI that's just trying to make paperclips and wants to do nothing but make more paperclips. So this AI would feel like an intense drive to make paperclips in whatever way an AI feels things, which may have non-measurable qualia.
Yes.
Now, to me,
is it, just to be clear, is it really consciously like really wants these paperclips?
Well, I would say that we don't know, but I want a model for the value of life that is, for me at least, that's not human-centric. So I want to be able to know when I'm looking at non-human entities, okay, does their life matter or not, without running a qualia test on them, because that's impossible.
No, that makes sense.
I guess I would say agency is a paperclip maximizer that can say, paperclips, I understand I'm programmed to do this, but I think there are other things in the world that matter, and I am going to act on those things, maybe while making a certain number of paperclips on the side because I feel I have to. Whereas with humans, agency as a measure would come out this way. Agency would come out as, I understand that like biologically, my ancestors who felt pain and pleasure due to specific environmental stimuli had more surviving offspring, but like, I am going to rise above that and act in ways that are able to disregard the pleasure I know I'm about to feel from something, or disregard the amount of pain I know I'm about to feel something, and work towards an objective I see as higher order than the objectives that were pre-programmed into me. And so this is sort of how we, but again, we don't just judge it on the amount of agency an entity has, but all entities that may exist in the future. And of course, this is millions, billions of potential entities that we need to take into account whenever we make any decision. Whereas I think within your world philosophy, you don't need to think about those, because a thing only gains this interest meter once it comes into existence.
Yes.
But I also think, Simone, do you want to talk about pronatalism more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, just to define, because I think a lot of people hear pronatalism and assume that it's like infinite people forever.
Yeah.
Infinite population growth, like to the moon. That is not actually what pretty much we've not encountered a single pronatalist who actually holds that view. Pronatalism, especially our school of it and the kind that is rising now, is about protecting and expanding plurality and human flourishing. And having children is a key part of that. Basically, that doesn't happen if some or many groups stop having kids. In fact, then you end up either with no people, no human flourishing, and a lack of that potential agency, or a monoculture, which is far more likely to rob people of their agency by being mimetically very fixed and dogmatic.
Yeah, so to clarify or expand on what you're saying there, as it's relevant to antinatalists, is this form of pronatalism is like really pro-antinatalism?
Yeah.
But certain types of antinatalism. Like we'd be very pro your type of antinatalism, which is very pluralistic. It's like some people have different views and we're okay with coexisting with them.
We never want a world, for example, in which people are forced to have kids, in which people are forced to do pretty much anything. We want bodily autonomy, and if people want to have no kids at all, like power to the people, like it's amazing.
Whereas there's other forms of antinatalism, like ethylism, which are like, no, everyone must have our ideology, and we do not allow for alternate ideologies because there is one true ideology and everyone must obey the one true ideology.
I've not heard of that interpretation of ethylism before. My understanding of ethylism was that it applied, and you probably know longer than me, but my understanding was that it applied in a non-speciesist way.
So
they would say we can't be pronatalists. Like, we shouldn't have kids.
Well, as in, like a government would come and...
Well, ethylists would
If
say...
ethylists like ruled the world.
Yeah.
So my understanding of ethylism is that it actually doesn't have a definition, which is one of the reasons it's really hard to talk about, because basically there's as many definitions as there are people who know what it is, right? So my understanding of ethylism is that so whilst antinatalists are against the bringing into existence of new sentient beings, I would say.
Yeah.
Some antinatalists restrict it to humans, but I have a more sentiocentric view. Whereas an ethylist, again, it's hard because it's not defined, but my understanding is that ethylism actively wants extinction of all sentient life.
Yeah.
So a key difference there, at least in the abstract, is that for me, antinatalism, if we were able to get to the point where people were able to extend their lifespan, I wouldn't care. Once you're born, it's your life. You want to live as long as possible, have at it, Hoss. Whereas an ethylist, I think, would actively want to bring about a world where there is no sentient beings in it. Now, the means by which they would do that is hotly debated between ethylists. But actually, there are many ethylists who do recognise that it could actually, in the short term, be good to bring children into existence.
Oh.
Because an ethylist is sentiocentric, they a lot of the time have conversations around wild animal suffering.
Yeah.
So they want to help wild animals because the way they see nature is that it's very brutal. Often wild animals will have very short and hard lives, and so actually, if we want to help them, the human species would need to continue. If extinctionists had their way and everyone just decided not to have kids now, it would be about 100 years. Humans wouldn't be around anymore.
Such an interesting conflict because
all the animals would still be eaten.
I'm so used to the other version where, like, typically when we're at a dinner party and we hear antinatalism come up, we talk about demographic collapse and we hear, oh, you know what? If there weren't any humans left on Earth, that would be kind of great. And then, by this one view, it's like, oh my gosh, so we're going back to just all the violence with the animals. That's amazing.
But this brings me to, I guess, the point. Most iterations of ethylism, or at least this branch, to us would seem like both authoritarian and a little patronizing of lower order animals, because they're like, we get to decide. I mean, if you asked if I was able to grant a dog the ability to speak, or a zebra even before it was killed by a lion, I don't think any of them would say, I don't want to exist anymore. They're like, we as smarter entities than you, and I think they feel that way towards my wife and I as well. We as more philosophically enlightened entities than you get to decide whether or not you should be allowed to do these things. You should be right in your assessment that life is worth living, whereas our philosophy is very much, you go do your own thing. We don't care so long as you don't interfere with others. And even in an extreme context, and here's something that I know that you balked at, because you balked at this when we said it on our show, is we believe very strongly that every individual should be allowed to choose. Like when we talk about these interest layers, every individual who has one of these should be allowed to choose when to end, like if they don't want to exist. But it should be that individual's choice. So by that what I mean is if we have kids and one of those kids, reaches a point where they're fully myelinated and a sentient adult, and they say, I don't want to exist anymore, that is their choice. However, I do not think that I have the right, me personally as an entity that formerly didn't exist, I really like existing. And if somebody had used that status, you are a non-existing entity at this point, therefore you have no rights in my world perspective to deny me the chance to decide whether or not I want to exist. Because right now I can kill myself if I want. I could choose not to exist if I wanted to. But my kids don't get that choice unless I bring them into the world. And to me, I guess if people want a different way to look at this, it might be more in line with like anti-natalist perspectives. Suppose like the world was just a bunch of sleeping people, okay? They're all unconscious and they're all asleep. And you could go around and just shoot the sleeping people, right? And be like, am I causing moral harm here? I don't know. Well, what you could do instead is wake up each sleeping person and say, hey, you want me to shoot you or not? And that's sort of what we're doing.
Right, so...
I think that's where the distinction before about like coming into existence rather than like having necessarily a conscious experience at all times.
So I think there's two things. The thought experiment you're talking about with sleeping people. So I can't remember if it was a conversation I had with you. I had a conversation with someone the other day where I was talking about exactly this, about sleeping people and whether it's okay to euthanize them basically when they're in that state. And I think there's two sort of, there's something we need to pass out here, which is when someone is sleeping, generally they're not conscious in the way that we would, like we came in the door, we can decide to do certain things, but they're dreaming. So they're still subjectively experiencing
Not during all
something.
stages of sleep.
Not during all stages of sleep.
So hypothetically, for this argument's sake, let's say they're in the type of sleep where they're not. But continue.
Quick nap.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's no point in complicating the thought experiment with...
Yeah.
Okay.
So the thing that I think is important here is that if in the thought experiment you're talking about these people have not been sentient, then they've never been sentient, waking them up is essentially bringing a new being into existence. Even though we're describing it as sleep, essentially for all intents and purposes, they don't exist in any tangible way. It's a physical body, but in a morally relevant way, we would be bringing them into existence. So I think that would essentially be equivalent to birthing a new person, basically. So their antinatalists would disagree, but if these are people who have gone to sleep, they've been asleep for like 8 hours or whatever, these people have established interests that once they wake up will reconnect continuity with that pre-existing interest, which, I mean, personally, I think...
Continue.
I was just going to say, personally, I think that's valuable. Like, when I am in sleep, I would, I have interests that are still being continued, and I have projects I want to finish, to pursue.
So I love this because I think it brings us to a core differentiation here and helps us bring through the sleeping analogy and through a real world potential sleeping analogy that we could imagine sort of where we disagree with the asymmetry argument, which I hope your listeners will know what the asymmetry argument is. I don't need to go.
Before we continue, there's just one thing I wanted to bring up. I think there's maybe a different understanding of sentience. Because you talked about levels of sentience. There's two understandings in terms of like sentience is something that you have on like it could be like a thermometer. You can have like a 0. So maybe you could argue that the kid that I haven't had yet is like at a 0. But they could be at a 10. And then maybe if they were like 95 and on the way down, they were like at a 5. Or you have the idea of like sentience is like a light that switches on. So maybe like a dog, the light is on for the dog. It's not on for my sock. Maybe it's on for the mosquito, something like that. And I think, I'm not sure if that's relevant, like a core part of your, just in terms of like the levels of
Sentience
sentience.
is like a meter for us, but
I think it is relevant for me because when I imagine about someone coming into existence in a morally relevant way, it is about the light coming on. So the light wasn't on in 1750, but I didn't think that, for me personally, I don't think that my level of sentience then was at a 0. I just think I didn't exist at all, like the light.
So it's like sentience is a sort of continuum on, you can have like, maybe a mosquito, as John was saying before, on one end, and on the other end an elephant or a human. But you can also just be completely off of the continuum.
I think I disagree, I think that sentience for me is just an on-off.
Yeah.
And then
It's there or it's not.
The other things are, capacity for pleasure, capacity for suffering, interest, etc.
I understand what you mean.
The reason why this is important is because it gives him a discrete moment in which a human life comes into existence.
Yes.
And then that discrete moment is when the interest meter begins to attach to the human. Whereas we don't believe in a discrete moment in which a human comes into existence, which is one of the core reasons we don't believe in that model of an interest meter.
Yes.
So this is why he says this, and I understand that it is, I just would say, like, when is that exact moment? Like, when is the exact moment the light switches? Because if there isn't an exact moment when the light switches, then that means humans exist in shades of potentiality. And if humans exist in shades of potentiality, then they can have interests before they, before conception, for example.
Yes.
Can I quickly, I just wanted to ask you quick, because I think you were saying something before which brought up in my mind a difference which is worth sort of illuminating. So when you talk about potential beings that could come into the future, could come into existence in the future, I sort of see them as there's two sort of categories, and I sort of call them contingent and non-contingent. So whatever John and I do, we're just two individuals. We can only have control over a certain number of beings who could come into existence. So it's, because we're men, and it's sort of like women can only have one kid. However, every is it 1.5 years or something like that?
Roughly, yeah.
So in theory, we could have many children. We have control over whether those beings will come into existence. So they're contingent.
And you can influence other people.
And we can influence other people, but there are many beings who will come into the future we have no control over. And those, I would say, are not contingent. They're like not contingent on our actions. So I think both John and I would agree that for those beings, we should act as if we should take them into account in our actions.
Yes.
So, for example, this has implications for things like climate change, right? So we know there are going to be future generations, but we shouldn't take into account the contingent beings which we're going to decide not to come into existence. So if we don't have kids, we just don't need to take them into account when we're making decisions about the future. But if we decide to have kids, those kids then will exist in the future. So it's like there are beings that could exist but won't, and we don't think that they should.
So here's where this comes into relevance within our framework. So if you looked at just our framework and you didn't take this view that you're taking, somebody might be like, well, then aren't you responsible for basically killing every kid you could have had that you didn't have? Like, why don't you have 500 kids? Why don't you put every dollar you have into surrogates, right? And it's like, yes, but we are not just responsible for the lives of our children. We are responsible for the near infinite number of human lives that will come after them. And if we just spam infinite number of children into the world, that will have deleterious effects down the timeline of human history. And so we need to take into account not just our own kids' lives. Some people would be like, well, then, you've killed every child you haven't had. But it's like, yeah, but by having those extra kids, I've significantly negatively impacted or maybe even killed humans that could exist 500 years from now, but didn't because I improperly spent resources.
Yes.
Which is very aligned with your view on resource spending. So I don't know, does that answer your question or sort of?
Well, if you want to put it like this, fail to bring someone into existence, I wouldn't call it killing them, because it's like John was saying, in the year 1750, none of us existed. The question wouldn't even make sense to ask someone, what was the year like to you in 1750? In the year 1750, none of us existed. There was no interest.
On our worldview, but not.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, on our worldview.
Yes.
Like none of us existed in a way that, we exist now and we each have an interest in continuing to exist and many other things. But in 1750, we simply didn't exist or want to come into existence. And future beings, that's the case today.
But just because a being hasn't been born yet. So, like, if I set up a claymore today and it goes off in a room when a door opens in 500 years, just because that being hasn't been born yet doesn't mean I haven't robbed it of rights.
Yes.
And I think it's a painless killing claymore. So for us, it's just like I've removed. I still think I've done a moral negative there.
I don't quite understand what you mean.
Okay, so suppose I rig a bomb to this door, and nobody opens this door for 500 years.
Yeah.
The person who opens this door hasn't been born yet. Their parents haven't been born yet.
Yeah.
It still and it kills them without any pain. It just vaporizes it.
So they do come into existence at some point, and then it kills them.
Yeah. But you would say that, okay, if this is, I'm going to try to model your response to this. It would be like, yes, if the claymore was affiliated with like their conception and only killed them at conception, then it wouldn't be a moral negative.
No.
But they have rights because they had already been born, and you would have expected them to have already been born by the time the claymore went off, even though they weren't born when you loaded the claymore. Is that correct?
I think this does this go to your non-contingent argument.
Exactly,
Like, you wouldn't do anything in the future that would hurt people who are have not been able to prevent from existing.
Yeah, so it's like, I think maybe you're basing your thought experiment off Derek Parfit's The Broken Glass in the Woods. Have you heard of this?
No.
I think it's Paul McCaskill's in the. Oh no,
Is it? I thought he took it from.
You're right, it's Derek Parfit.
So Derek Parfit, very famous philosopher. So he came up with this thought experiment of basically trying to demonstrate to people that we should care about beings who haven't come into existence yet, if they will come into existence.
Yeah.
He used the example of like, if you're walking in the woods and you find some broken glass, or you put some broken glass there, it doesn't matter if in 5 minutes a kid is going to come and run on it, or a kid who's not born yet in 50 years is going to run on it. The consequences for that being is going to be the same. And so it doesn't matter if they do or don't exist yet. If they will exist, then they matter. So I would say that strapping a bomb to the door is bad because there are people that will exist. But
follow-up question then. What if you could time travel back to 1750 and sterilize without them realizing it your ancestor who led to you? Like, would you do that? Because that's connected to you. It's not like necessarily connected to that many non-contingent people.
I guess so. The basic question you're asking is just like, if somehow I had control over whether I would exist or not.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting one. So the thing is that I actually don't think antinatalists would have an issue with people coming into existence if they could choose to. But obviously, at least on our worldview, that's impossible because you have to exist to choose to be able to come into existence, if you get what I mean. Because, one of the main issues that antinatalists have is that it's one or two people making a decision on behalf of someone else.
Conversions of the consent argument. Basically.
Yeah.
Yes, whereas we see it the other way. We see one or two people deciding without another individual's choice to have them not exist. Whereas if I bring an individual to exist, they can always decide not to exist whenever they want.
That's true, but you're putting someone in a position where the only way they can reverse your decision is to kill themselves. And I'm sure, as you would agree, like, putting someone in a position where they would have to kill themselves to escape, it's not the best position.
I disagree. I guess in both of our families, we have much more close relationships with suicide or like voluntary euthanasia through different mechanisms each time. And these are people who all have lived very good lives and were very happy. And then basically reached the point where they were like, yep, diminishing marginal returns, or like, after this point, it's not going to be good anymore. I'm ending it now. And it seems to be a very logical choice.
None of them would say, I wish I hadn't been born. Like, all of these individuals who we know who committed suicide, none of them would say, oh, everything I got to experience up until the suicide was bad. That was all worth living.
Two of the people in their final moments were looking at photos of their family and memory. So we know, like, they had really, like, they would not have chosen to undo that by any stretch of the imagination.
So I think when I said that, there are other values like the asymmetry that we can get into, but what I was understanding that you were saying was that if you bring someone into existence and they have like a bad life and would want to kill themselves, then I would say that doesn't seem like the best approach to this issue. Because it's sort of like it's taking a reckless decision on behalf of someone else who wasn't able to make it.
We actually agree. I mean, that's what Malcolm was saying earlier, was that we actually think it's a really bad idea to choose to bring people into the world if you believe that they are going to want to kill themselves, or you believe that they are going to live really miserable lives because you are causing more damage. You're probably causing more future deaths and loss of future agency, which is what we're trying to personally maximize. So I think we agree with you on that.
And I think as well, just on the kill yourself point, I do actually agree that a lot of the harm of suicide, or one of the harms that would happen, is that people aren't brought into a culture where that would be, they'll be gaslit and saying like, you should be grateful that you're here.
Yeah.
Whereas if you genuinely had a culture that said that you can make the conscious decision and you're not going to be shamed for it.
And your family should be happy for you.
Yeah.
Because presumably you made the decision that lowered your own suffering, which is a harder thing.
And suffering is very hard for families, too.
I think that a lot of the harm of suicide could be negated in that supportive culture.
But hold on, before we go further here. The reason why we are okay with taking this gamble to bring a person into existence, or one of the reasons we're okay, is that if you ask the average person, like, do you want to be alive? They're going to say yes. So when we make a gamble and we're bringing a baby into existence, if it turned out that the vast majority of humans didn't want to exist, then this gamble would be quite different.
We'd be the baddies.
Yeah, but in a world where the vast majority of humans do want to exist, and we are removing that choice from them, it seems like, I don't know, to me almost an obvious moral harm.
I'm not sure, because this is the point I was going to come back to, because I definitely agree. You said about, if I'm not mistaken, you're planning on having 8 children, is it?
But we'll have as many as we can.
As many as you want to.
Yeah.
Let's say that you have 20.
Nice. Let's say that.
But you said about how, like, you had, like, if you brought in infinite numbers of people, and
that would be bad.
That would be really, really irresponsible.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, like, whatever number that you stop at would be like the 21st, if that makes sense. Like, I'm from a family of, like, there's 4 of us, which is quite big by you.
Right.
And I'm there just thinking, like, if my parents did it for my own benefit, what about the 5th kid? Like, it wouldn't have made that much of a difference to them.
Yeah, that's right.
It would have made a big difference to the 5th kid.
Yeah.
It would have made a huge difference to the 5th
And that's
kid.
the way we feel with every incremental kid. It's like, okay, do we stop now? Well, I mean, how do I explain to the kid who doesn't exist yet? And this is the thing, I had a mom who kept wanting me to not have more kids. She was like, 2 kids, you can invest all of your resources in them, everything like that. And then every time a new kid would come, she'd be like, was this the one you didn't want to exist? And she goes, no, I love this kid. This kid's perfect. And so I think it's very easy to deny someone the right to make the choice for their own existence when you haven't interacted with them yet. It's just that you believe genuinely and holistically, and there's nothing we can do to convince you otherwise, that a being that hasn't been born yet has 0 rights. The reason why we are so afraid, or one of the reasons we're so afraid to make that, is it falls into the great history of bad moral decisions where a person says entities that are like me in these ways have rights, and entities that are dislike me in these ways don't have rights.
But
I think
the thing is the way we see it is they're not entities, and there is the distinction again of if they will exist. Like, I think John and I would agree that the people staying next door, their kid that isn't born yet but is will come into existence. We've got no control. That child should be given the best life possible and is morally relevant, not just then, but is morally relevant to our decisions now.
But would you, if you could convince them to not have that child?
I think that'd be fine.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference as well. Just a bit uncomfortable with the conversation around rights in terms of, like, do you mean rights in terms of just as a generic, because people use it for, like, just generically, like, moral value is someone that has rights, or do you mean rights in terms of, like, defined things either morally or legally?
I guess when I say rights, what I mean is some sort of moral weight to actions that affect a person.
Yes, so we would agree. So, like, the Claymore example, we'd say, well, likelihood is that in 500, it wouldn't matter when it is. If I plant a bomb behind the door, there's a very decent chance that someone will stumble across it. And that person at the time that they stumble across it would have moral value. So I can almost make, like, an expected value calculus of my actions now without thinking that, therefore, that person exists now.
So I think the Claymore example and the glass example, I think, are bad because they're morally charged in the way they affect people. What if we did? Have you guys ever played Mass Effect? We could do the Krogan example. What if you...
I played it like 10 years ago.
Okay, so in Mass Effect, one of the guys releases something called the genophage. And the genophage is just like a virus that goes out and it makes it so that one species that has been uniquely terrible to the galaxy for a long time, now only like 1 in 100 of their sperms and eggs are viable. It doesn't fully sterilize them, but it just means that they have dramatically fewer offspring than they otherwise would have. So you can choose to hit the genophage switch or not hit the genophage switch for, like, humanity or for a species. Like,
Yeah.
do you think that that is a moral negative to hit the genophage?
Are we ignoring all the sort of external
Well, I mean, I think
calculations? Are we just talking about concerning the beings that will no longer come into
Yeah.
existence?
yeah, concerning the beings that will, because obviously you could say, oh, it makes that species sad, and that's what they focus on in the games.
Yes,
But I'm
we'll,
saying,
we'll assume
suppose
that
that
doesn't happen.
culture
Okay,
adapts.
Yeah, they don't
Culture
realize
adapts.
Yeah, yeah. Then I mean, obviously ignoring all of the sort of violation of bodily autonomy of the people.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you know, if you have to inject it into them or anything like that, but just focusing on the beings who won't come into existence anymore. No, I wouldn't.
I'm
You
not
would-
so
you'd
sure.
flip the switch?
I think with the
So, no, I mean, as in, I would
Yeah.
flip the
Yeah, you'd
switch.
flip the
Yeah,
switch. Yeah.
But so I wouldn't think that it is a bad thing that they would no longer come into existence.
Yeah.
does this species have moral agency?
Yes.
They do have moral agency.
Yes, but they are much more likely to make morally negative decisions than other species.
Well, here's the.
And we're ignoring all of those external things as well.
Yes.
The question is simply, is it bad that one person is coming into existence rather than 100?
Well, no, you've made a decision that people who otherwise definitely would have come into existence are not coming into existence. Yeah.
And
Okay, cool.
But this species, they won't be sad about it. They will adapt to just being 1% as infertile.
They'll be sad about it for a while, and eventually they'll go extinct. And I assume that this has let's take the sadness out of it because it complicates things.
The reason I asked about the moral agency is because I think this is a really relevant point when it comes to non-human animals, in the way that I'm in favour of like people sterilising their pets rather than letting their pets fuck what they want and and just literally breed like rabbits, and then these rabbits have pretty terrible lives. And that's actually relevant for the environmental point, because Lawrence and I disagree with the idea that humanity is a cancer, needs to go, and nature would just flourish into a beautiful biodiversity. No, it's not. If there's any beings that live there, it's really bad. And this is why that I'm personally in favour, in the same way that I'm in favour of sterilising pets for the good of their offspring. I would be in favour of sterilising wild animals in a hypothetical. What that means in terms of practically, it's a very unpopular decision. I really don't know why. But I can't see a moral distinction between the pets in one example and the wild animals.
I'm okay with sterilising wild animals as well.
But in
for
this,
population control and stuff like that.
But in this example, but the reason I'm against it for people is that people have moral agency, and I don't want to make decisions on behalf of someone with moral agency. So if this species was like a rabbit and didn't have moral agency, and you sterilise my pet rabbit, I wouldn't see a problem with it. If they were like a person and had moral agency, in the same way that a bunch of people do stuff that I disagree with, but I don't go and interfere with their autonomy.
But is that not just? Are you not just saying that because you think it will have wider negative consequences? Like, you don't go and interfere in other people's business to violate their autonomy because you know that will have wider negative implications. Whereas for this thought experiment, we're just cancelling those out.
No, genuinely, I do have a problem with violating the autonomy of moral agents. So, like, a lot of the time with anti-natalist, you hear like the big red button if the world just goes poof. And interestingly, a surprising number of like
they want to push it.
Non-antinatalists want that's the thing. I'm really not comfortable to make a decision on behalf of a load of moral agents.
Interesting.
And a really, really bad PR move for antinatalists right now to keep banging on about this red button, because we look like Thanos,
Yeah.
So I think there's a point for me about deciding on behalf of other moral agents in a way that I would be less concerned about using the pet example.
So I want to go to the example that we were talking about earlier, because I found the sleeper ship example, because I thought it was so powerful, because I think it really distinctly, the way you were like, if this is an entity that has never had consciousness before, right? So I'm like, oh, okay, let's talk about this in like a potentially real world example. So we are colonizing the stars, and some of the ships that we are using to colonize the stars have completely lab-grown humans in them, in sacks, that have never been woken before. It is ships with a planet-size level, millions of humans, all with personalities encoded in them, maybe even memories taken from individuals on Earth beforehand. But these specific individuals have never woken up before. It's just a big sleeper ship.
They're all turned on.
But they need to be turned on or not turned on. Now, where this gets interesting, so before I go to this moral question, because I think it's an interesting moral question, and the reason it's an interesting moral question is it goes into our human potentiality idea, which is to say that these individuals have much more potentiality to be like fully actualized humans than like a sperm and an egg or an embryo, or for some people even a baby. So it's easier to understand what we're saying when we say you have additional moral weight to robbing an entity that has a lot of potentiality to its existence, like me doing something that prevents a baby from being born. Let's put it this way. If I stop an egg and a sperm from coming together, that has about the same negative moral weight as me killing an embryo right after the egg and the sperm come together. Because those two things had about the same level of potentiality in the great time scale thing. But these entities that are hanging in this ship have an enormous amount of potentiality. And here's where this matters when we're talking about the asymmetry argument. So in the asymmetry argument, you know, the island example is the one that's always used. They're like, oh, you come to an island, no one's on it, you know. And I think that this island example, it doesn't really play well with potentiality because a person...
Can you explain the island example? Because I'm not actually sure of...
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah, for the audience as well, yes. Okay, so the island example goes like this. If you are out on the ocean and you discover an island, you see an island in the distance, no one's ever seen this island before. You get to the island and it turns out there are people on the island suffering. And you're like, shit, the world's a worse place than I thought it was. If you get to the island and the island turns out to have no people on it, but those no people are obviously not experiencing happiness, the world is not a worse place than you thought it was. There isn't bad there, right? Yeah. The problem, I think, with this island example is you're getting to the island and it isn't immediately obvious in your evoked set that there was a potentiality for human life on this island. If you get to the island and it's full of abandoned buildings and children's toys and obviously a civilization had been there, but recently, and when we go into it in our book, we're like, okay, it turns out you found out how they all died. There was no pain. Turned out somebody had done some like weird nuclear testing near the island and it just sterilized everyone on the island. And this culture didn't even have the concept of pain or unhappiness. They were just like a purely happy culture. So they all went extinct without even feeling negative about it. I think most people would still be like, really, really like, oh my God, that was a really bad thing that happened because the high level of potentiality of this place. And it's the same with the sleeper ship. And this is why I guess we assign value to lives that don't exist yet if they have the potentiality to exist.
If I'm understanding correctly, isn't there a difference between the sleeper ship and the island though? Because in the sleeper ship, there is no one who was, right? It's just full of beings who could exist in terms of having like a subjective experience. But with the island example, my understanding is that what the person is saying is bad is the fact that those people were in existence and their society collapsed.
Because, so they were in existence and now they're no longer here. Their society is no longer here. The read here is that if an outsider had not interfered, their society. Now, the outsider interference didn't cause pain or anything like that.
Yeah, they assume they all lived their full lives.
Yeah, but it caused potential humans who would have existed to not exist. Yeah. Same with the sleeper ship. With a sleeper ship, you know, you have the choice to just let the bodies rot. You can be like, okay, I'm actually like a negative utilitarian, and they idiotically put me in charge of being the pilot of this ship. And after I land, I just decide not to switch on this civilization. Have I done a moral wrong? I think to me, it just seems so obvious the person has done like this tremendous moral wrong. But I think
the difference between the island example and the sleep ship for me, it comes back to the moral agency point. So I'm guessing in the islands example, these are moral agents who I'm guessing had some, well, even if they necessarily didn't, you presume that they did want to have kids because they've been having them from there. So, and a third actor decided for these moral agents that they weren't going to procreate. That's where it comes, that's where it's wrong for me. It's not to do with the potentiality, it's to do with the harm of those who existed at the time, of being robbed of their agency for those who existed at that point.
I used to get the feeling that most people didn't really see agency as like a meaningful thing that would be lost. And Malcolm kept telling me, no, I mean, you're weird on this. But now I'm thinking to a short story contest that took place on Twitter for who could make the saddest short story in just a few words. And the one that won was just 2 shoes for sale, never used.
This
Two
isn't
baby
from
shoes
Twitter.
for
It's an
sale.
older
Okay,
story.
older
Yeah.
stuff,
This
yeah.
is from
I know
a
this.
competition of
that,
writers.
that I mean, like what it.
Six-word stories or something.
Yes, yeah, 6-word story, yeah, something like that. But like, so like the what makes people sad is this concept of baby shoes that are for sale and were never used. We don't know that like there was a miscarriage or a baby died. All we know is that there was a baby that could have been, and it's not, and somehow that hits a huge number of people.
Yes.
So that makes me believe that like there is sort of a broader intuition that does care about the potentiality there, and that does see the sadness in lost potential.
I think of that in terms of the sad parents, because although I obviously am an antinatalist at 28, a lot of people around me are at least thinking about having kids if they're not having them already. And I still feel happy for the parents. I like seeing this happiness, even if I disagree where it's come from. In the same way that I see a picture of people at Christmas and they're tucking in some dead animals, and obviously we're ethical vegans. I don't appreciate they're eating the dead animals, but I like seeing the happiness of everyone coming together for Christmas.
Over
So
the course of the victim.
That's just where I come in. That's what seems sad to me, is the idea of someone buying the shoes. It's the parents' sadness.
Their sadness.
Their expectation
Yes.
and all of this sort of stuff. Because often for people, having children is one of the sort of significant things they do in their life. You know, there's a lot of
big life
expectation
milestone.
around it. And I mean, my understanding would be in that story that a lot of people would assume it's maybe like a miscarriage or something like that. I also think if like what John said, it's that represents 2 people's lives going in a much worse direction than they expected. Which obviously we feel sad for them.
Yeah.
Or at least in a direction that it didn't go. Like they planned it to go.
I can't help but think of the baby. I'm like, oh my god, the baby's
But hold on.
here.
So the other area we have a huge disagreement in our world philosophy, so we haven't talked about here, is the value or lack of value in suffering.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, and I sort of mentioned like the paperclip maximizers before, human utilitarians, human like emotional utilitarians, it's like a group of paperclip maximizing robots discussing whether or not paperclips have intrinsic value.
Yeah.
It's like, of course you think, and people will come to me, they're like, oh, Malcolm, you wouldn't want to feel pain. And I'm like, that's like one paperclip maximizing robot going to another. One crazy paperclip maximizing robot comes and goes, guys, got a crazy idea here. Maybe paperclips don't matter that much. And then one of the other robots goes, you wouldn't want to stop making paperclips. And it's like, well, yes, I've been programmed to make paperclips. I understand. We're all in the paperclip maximizing boat. But like, maybe we were just programmed to feel this way, and there is something of value above paperclips.
I definitely agree. And this is the point of like, what you think things. We actually made a point recently about against the total view of population ethics based upon well-being. This idea that well-being exists somewhere out there in the ether, obviously the opposite of suffering, and we want to make more of it. And I don't think that it has any kind of moral value based upon the fact that individuals who do exist experiencing it. But I definitely do agree that in terms of like cosmic meaning, this is a moral subjectivist, in terms of like cosmic meaning, suffering has no moral weight compared to anything else, compared to the colour of my socks. But in terms of my subjective morality, it's like, we've all been programmed. We're all in the paper business, and therefore, when it comes to my actions and the actions of others, you know that there's almost extreme example. You might have come across someone who has genuinely purified this out of them, who wouldn't mind you kicking them or whatever, you know.
So here's a really interesting idea that Simone came up with earlier today that I found really valuable. She goes, look, if you take the agency view of life value, right, like things that have more agency have more value, suffering can still be a negative value insofar as it impacts individual agency, which means extreme suffering is a thing of negative value, but mild suffering is not a thing of negative value because mild suffering only guides decisions. It doesn't impede the decision-making process.
And in other words, you can, like, people even use suffering to remove agency from people, aka torture. So
Right, but I liked this definition because it's something that I intuitively feel is true. I do not feel that mild suffering is a negative thing.
What is your stance on that, mild suffering?
Can you give an example so we both understand?
The discomfort of realizing that you're not being as productive as you want to be, that you're not achieving your goals.
Or you said something that accidentally hurt a friend's feelings and you're feeling bad about it. Or
So I think there's 2 things once someone exists, I think there's two things we need, or at least two things we need to take into account with suffering. So the first is the actual experience of that, and then the other thing is the instrumental value that can come from that. So a common example that I'll use, which I think is in the same ballpark, is going to the gym. So going to the gym, it's a mild form of suffering. You know, there's discomfort. So that a lot of people say, well, how can pain, be bad? Because people go to the gym. The first thing I think to notice is that that is pain the individual has voluntarily brought upon themselves. So which differs from antinatalism because it's one or two people putting pain, suffering, whatever negative thing you want to say on someone else. So I think that's the first thing to know. But the other thing is that it's the experience of pain is negative, but the reason people value it is because of the instrumental value that it brings. So they elect to go through the discomfort because it brings them it satisfies some longer term or greater goal they have. So to become more physically competent or something like that. So to put this into context of antinatalism, to me and presumably to John, it makes sense once someone exists to say, I'm going to go through some suffering now to achieve some greater goal. It doesn't make sense to say, I'm going to have a kid so that they can suffer in the gym, so that they can become more competent, because they don't exist to need the competency to achieve any goal at that point, if you get what I mean.
And I think this is where, for me, it draws the distinction between harm and suffering, because often if I'm talking about like wild animals, for example, people go, but suffering isn't always bad because, your tooth hurts and then you have to go to the dentist and you realise it stops greater harm down the line. Yeah. And it's like, no, I wouldn't consider that a harm. Like the pain of the dentist drilling in your tooth, I wouldn't consider it harm. It might be unpleasant in the moment, but I wouldn't consider that a harm. Being eaten alive by another animal, that seems to suck.
Pretty bad experience.
Pretty bad experience, which is...
And I was just going to say... Oh, sorry, go on.
And so the harms that I think are relevant for antinatalism, especially as you're saying, Lawrence, because they are imposed, we are talking about those harms. There is, unfortunately, in the antinatalist community, a very strong kind of like anti-work kind of push.
Well, that's everywhere.
Well, not in the pronatalist community.
That's fair, actually.
But for me, I find that a bit like it doesn't. I get the fact that you didn't want to be born into a world. You didn't choose to come into a world where you have to work to put food on the table. I totally get that, but
it doesn't help to moan about it.
It doesn't help to moan about it. Like there are worse harms that we are likely to face than having to go and talk to your annoying co-workers for 8 hours a day. You know what I mean? Like there's a trend in the antinatalist community, I think, to focus too much on kind of like mild suffering compared to what I would consider like...
So we do, I'm curious, in terms of like upbringing and comfort, we feel like most of the pronatalists we know often have suffered a great deal in childhood. And this is often harmful, this is often non-consensual. So like the bad kind, not the good kind.
One of the most famous pronatalists is Elon, and if you read his biography, like he went through enormous suffering in childhood. And you look at like myself, right? Enormous suffering in childhood. And I think a lot of people
in very poor countries as well.
Where
they're very much like fighting for life, fighting for a better future, and like they're definitely not giving up. And we also see that most of the people we know who are anti-natalist are, as far as we can tell, pretty highly educated, very articulate, which implies to us that they grew up somewhat, at least like middle class, somewhat privileged. They were not getting as much as many of these pro-natalist people we know, the bad pain.
I think this is maybe as a result of, I don't know exactly all of the spaces you work in and stuff, but I think that may be just a bit of exposure bias in that you were probably more likely to be exposed to the more educated antinatalists. If you look in a lot of antinatalist groups, many of them live in, I'm not sure if this is the politically correct term now, but like third world countries.
Interesting.
Many of them don't get to antinatalism through a consideration of Bennett's asymmetry and this sort of stuff.
They're just like life sucks.
Just that, it's the experience. It's what they see in front of them, and they say, I just don't think we should be creating more of that.
Not to mention the cultural perspective in developing countries tend to be more religious, more conservative. Makes it difficult to come out as well. And that's one of the reasons you're saying about like where are the female antinatalists? They are in these Facebook groups, but they're not very public because difficulties around.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Wait, why would women get flack for?
Because if you are in, suppose like a strict
Oh, and
is
religious
Islamic
culture.
culture.
Oh,
I mean,
really?
you're
Women as
Somali.
things, that's their purpose.
Yeah.
You interviewed an antinatalist from Somalia.
Yeah.
Like, I could literally be killed.
Yeah,
No, that's true. I'm assuming that
So-
many
so-
antinatalists are also atheist, and that's probably.
So it's just that you're
Yeah.
not seeing them is the point that
Yeah.
they're making. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's an accurate
That's a
point.
valid point.
But
yeah.
to the previous chain of conversation, which something I wanted to talk about because I think it's something that people intuitively know, like when we're talking about why agency matters, I also think when you talk to the average person, like I think that's where the brain in the vat experiment comes from. Like you're talking about all sorts of like moral harms to an individual. Like I genuinely do not think suffering or happiness has moral value. And I think when you put other people in this position, when you ask the brain in the vat experiment example, like, would you be okay with being a brain in a vat that just had felt nothing but positive emotions, but you had no real world agency? I think the vast majority of people would say no. A modicum of agency is worth more to me than a lifetime of bliss.
And we say that because we wrote a book where this was like one of many like thought experiments we presented.
Yeah.
We asked many people this, and I would say 1 out of 10 would say, "Give me the VAT," but only 1 out of 10, which surprised us.
And so,
well, that might be a result of status quo bias. So, for example, if you said to someone, "I can hook you up to a VAT now, and your life will be way much better," they don't want to do it because.
It's still
Well,
different.
some people, some
Different
people say,
than-
they see it as fake. But if you flip it and someone came through the door now and said to us all, actually, you're in the brain in a VAT simulation now.
Would you like?
Would you like to come out? People's answers are very different.
Yeah.
really, I think most people would be like, get me out of the matrix. Like, that's the whole point, right? Like, that's the red pill, blue pill. We could do an experiment on this, but I'd say, I think most people intuitively would be like, if I don't have agency and I just am tricked into believing I have agency now, take me into the world where I have agency.
I think a lot of people would say that because, one, it's sort of, it's got a Hollywood sugarcoating on it.
Yeah, it's a heroic. Yeah.
No, I think after the Matrix, fewer people would do it because they'd assume that they'd end up in this world with bad food. They'd be like, bring me back. No.
But I think if someone were to say to the average person and say, all of the relationships you have now, everything you value here and now, that's going to be taken away from you if I'm to unplug you from the brain in a vat. I think a lot fewer people would want to go back into reality as we say it. There is also wider questions on what is reality, right? If that's what you're experiencing, maybe that is a completely as valid reality as it would be in reality, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, and I reckon there might be something about people not wanting to be like a loser. Like, no, just positive stuff in my head. I don't want to go and live in the Matrix ship and eat cold porridge or whatever they
It seems like the coward's way out.
Whereas if there was a culture that was just really like around that, I think that people probably choose to stay plugged into
makes people hide
especially the red pill, blue pill. Now that's become a fault. Like anyone who's
it's
like the opposite of
blue pills.
Basically.
Positively, exactly.
But with a lot of this, our differences, I think, are intuitive differences. Like they're not provable one way or the other, even with logical arguments as to which of these things have value. It's just different interpretations of reality. And this is one of the things that we always say about like the Ethalists, for example. Like I actually think the at least the version of Ethalism is like kill everyone, big red button. I'm like, actually, their entire worldview is logically consistent. It is not an inconsistent worldview. Our worldview is also logically consistent. It's just that, we're pluralistic. We say anyone can believe whatever they want. We want a thriving human civilization. They want to kill all people in the world. I'm like, I know which team I want to be on, but I don't think that they're logically inconsistent, which is something that I admire, that at least they're able to take positions that lead them to be shamed in society. Because I think that that's the core thing where I really dislike when somebody's like, oh, I won't take any positions that cause shaming.
One thing I'm also curious about is, my understanding is you are pluralistic antinatalist, so like you don't care if pronatalists keep having kids.
Well, so
you do.
I think,
you don't.
I think if I think I maybe speak for both of us, but you correct me if I'm wrong. Both of us, when it comes to ethics, you're always balancing different values, right? So we both think that coming into existence is a harm, but we also recognize other things are a harm. Like we both value autonomy. We both value things like consent. So we do see pronatalists who are having children as bringing people into existence, which will be a harm to that child. But we also value autonomy, and there's a whole legal side to these things as well. So I think both of us would like people to voluntarily not procreate.
You'd like to convince
we don't want to
Yes.
force people to do. Yeah, well, I say we don't want to. We won't force.
Yeah,
If you could choose without interfering with individuals' choices or anything like that, you would choose a dead world over the world we have now.
Well, I think the
Dead.
water's a bit coloured
Okay,
by the word dead.
okay. A world without any life or sentience as a morally superior world to the world we live in today.
Like just comparing Earth to Mars, for example.
Yeah, if we
With
compare
that.
Earth to Mars,
Yeah.
I think Mars is a better
Mars-
state of affairs.
Yes. Especially with respect to wild animals.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go further then. So let's say, in the distant future,
Yeah.
humans develop sufficient technology that allow us to shut off any both physical pain or mental pain whenever we want.
Yeah.
Transhumanist utopia.
Yeah, exactly. You have a
We're
George
not
Bland
that
shuts
far
off.
from it, by the
I
way.
say we're big fans of David Pearce. David Pearce is an
Yeah.
anti and he's like me, he's a soft antinatist in terms of the Darwinian game has brought us this. There's lots of suffering, lots of harm going
So
on.
fix it.
So yes, so he should.
Overcome, rise above.
That's why we
But
do the
in
genetic
this
stuff.
world, right? In this world, yeah, because we're in that camp too. Like, let's totally rise above. In that world, would you no longer be anti-natalist because you know that no one without their consent will suffer?
Yes, I think so. You've got a planet like Mars. Just assume no sentient life on Mars, and then you have Earth, but the transhumanist Earth, where there is no suffering. Everyone's living great lives. This is where I think there's a perspective that's missed. I think they're both morally neutral, or morally the same, simply because the beings who were on that world who do come into existence, from my perspective, they wouldn't have missed out if they hadn't done. If their
So
parents,
you have no
But
like cool
Wow.
factor, like no cool factor at all.
But here's the cool factor.
Okay.
Because a lot of people, when they're doing this thought experiment, they think of themselves as a third party, and they are happy about seeing the gleaming world. So in that world,
Yeah.
I would see the world
Oh,
full of
because
happy.
the person is the
And
happy.
because I'd be happy, that would increase the amount of happy. I would say yes.
No.
Because I, as an existing being, I'm looking at these two scenarios, and I can choose that scenario, which makes me
okay.
happy.
Let's make a trolley equation then, right?
Okay.
Okay. So now we just discovered that like there are two universes, and one has just the Mars, and one has the thriving.
Yes, the David Pearce.
Yes. And you have one of them is going to turn off. You have to
Yes.
decide where the trolley is going to crash into and break a reality.
Oh no, it would make me happy to have lots of thriving.
Yeah,
So you are gonna So you're
Yes.
gonna you're
But
gonna.
that is-
But that's
Because
because
he
I
exists.
already exist in this life.
Because
Yes.
it's already existing
Yeah.
just to make
Yes.
this decision.
Yeah.
Whereas for us, it would be the clearest, most obvious decision in the world if one had potentiality and the other didn't have potentiality.
Yeah.
Which shows why when we look at... So here's another potential world that I'm going to describe for you, because we are very, very close to this potential world. So, we work with researchers now who look at embryos, because obviously we've done this with our embryos. We have selected our embryos for their genes to be happier than other embryos.
And we've
to
actually
be-
chosen
happiness specifically is one
lower
of the
risk
things
of
that
depression,
we-
anxiety, inability to deal with stress.
Yeah. So in a few generations, if you look, if we were doing 50 embryos and we choose 5 per generation, just within 5 generations, that will change the average experience of every one of our embryos within these highly heritable traits clusters by about 3 standard deviations. So just like enormously, we're already changing as a species because, but what this research also means is we can create AI models of embryos and ask those AI models questions. Now, they're not going to be perfect. I mean, with existing technology, they'd probably be right about 75% of the time.
So essentially, you're creating a model of the person you're going to create, so you can ask them questions before.
Yes, like,
right.
do you consent to exist? Suppose there's a world where we make this technology better. It's like 95% effective, but still not
Right,
perfectly
right.
effective. In that world, do you think that that's a better world than Dead Mars? Or do you think, even potentially, and now actually even potentially better, this is a world with just as much suffering on it as Earth has today? Do you think that that world where you can ask an individual's right to consent to exist is a better world than the perfect world where almost no one experiences pain? Which of those two worlds is a better world?
So with this thing that's asking the questions, is that thing sentient?
No.
It's just an algorithm.
No more,
Yes,
no
just-
more than our existing
Well, then-
AIs.
Then there's no real difference between that world and this world. It's only that you can be more sure that the person you will create is going to be happy, right? But that doesn't change the fundamental underlying ethics.
But you're kind of asking them whether or not they consent to exist. So you can now always get consent as to whether or not an entity can exist or not.
Yes, but the thing is that if you don't create them, there will be like you still won't be.
You see no moral weight to that at all. Yeah, I guess
I think the line is very.
I think
really
it's
trying to
better. I
struggle,
just
yeah.
don't think
Yeah.
it's
Because
good.
the consent to me comes from some degree of like moral agency. That's why we have consent laws. Like very young children can't consent to certain stuff. That obviously some degree of like moral agency. So in this world, you're able to get the consent without first creating the moral agency.
By looking.
Okay, but hold on. I'll word it differently because I think this would be more interesting.
I think I'm just being a bit slow.
What if? Well, okay, we'll say it has 100% of predicting what the person's going to end up doing, because it also in this future with better technology,
Yes.
it also models their upbringing. It also models other things that it
Yes.
predicts around them. Okay, you turn it on and it starts being like, please, 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 don't kill me. Make sure to have me. I really want to exist. Please, whatever you do. Now, it can't feel anything. It's just modeling what it thinks the person would do if you switched it on.
Yeah.
Are you still okay with like, no, you don't exist yet? Like,
So,
No, well, but they don't.
But they don't exist. They don't exist.
They don't exist.
yeah, it's just an algorithm.
Yeah, but it's still begging. It's begging.
no, but
But it's
it's
an
not
algorithm.
begging. The
It's
algorithm is
Yeah.
telling you what they would say if they already exist.
Yeah.
But well, so the
For me,
line is so
for me
clear.
personally, that's no different
If
than
no
like
one
if I
exists,
had a
yeah.
kid now, I'm pretty sure that they would enjoy their birthday cake when they're 5.
Yeah.
If I took the birthday cake away from them, they'd cry. But I'll give them my birthday cake back. But for me, that's no difference to that now. Like, they don't exist. Like I can model now that they would have this positive experience.
Yeah, but the modeling means nothing.
Yeah,
Unless it makes you sad, in which case then it matters.
Well, no, seriously, yes. If it made existing beings' lives
Sad.
worse,
It made parents
to do-
sad because they heard their.
that would be morally considerate, and that's one thing about the
That's so
asymmetry. Where people say, like, imagine you had a life that had like a pinprick worth of harm. Like their life was great, but with a pinprick.
Yeah.
From my perspective, which is that suffering is relevant, even is morally considered, even if there's no one to miss out on that suffering. Whereas, which is basically the asymmetry, whereas pleasure is only relevant for those that do exist. In that world, it would still be a harm to create that person, but it'd be a pinprick's worth.
Yeah, it'd be a
of harm.
very small harm.
Whereas if it made the parents really, really happy, you can say, well, okay, that overrides this pinprick's worth of harm.
Oh, so you're looking at net.
So my read is that probably this entire world, this conversation, everything up until this point was just created in an AI simulation to determine if someone should have me as a kid. They're just like, okay, let's put him in a conversation right here so we at least get to find out whether or not, because it's a world in which philosophers rule and every child's life has to be simulated. No, I love that. No, but okay, so with the pinprick's worth of harm, and I think this is why I feel so comfortable with my moral positions, is I think that with a lot of anti-natalist world positions, like when you don't make the moral assumptions we've had about like the potentiality of human life and stuff like that, it leads them to make a lot of claims that I think the average person wouldn't intuit as like sane moral claims, whereas I think our presumptions align much more with the decisions that like normal people would think are like normal things to think are good and evil.
Interesting. I think the asymmetry has quite a lot of popular support. Not in terms of if you state it as is a bad thing to bring to differences.
Yeah.
But there are those conditions where, again, I always forget the name, but there's a baby is born, they live for about 8 months, and then they die.
Yeah.
Peter Singer wrote a famous paper where he said it would be good to euthanize those kids, and then people twist it to say that he wants to
Kill baby. Of course.
Yeah, massively twisted that. But he was talking specifically about this position. A lot of people would say it would be a morally good thing for those parents to choose not to procreate.
And many parents abort when they know that that's going to happen.
Yes,
They
yes,
do that
before
all
the
the
fetus
time.
is sentient.
Yeah.
And people don't go, well, that was a neutral thing that you did because there was no one to miss out on that suffering. They say, no, that's actively a good thing. Whereas they don't think about, the kid that they didn't have yesterday with the cashier clerk missing out on their birthday cake. I think that people understand that, like, with the suffering, it's good if it doesn't occur, but they don't think of all the kids they didn't procreate. They're missing out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like asymmetries that people will accept when you present it to them in the practical sense.
Yes, but not if you say,
but
don't,
not if
therefore
you
don't have
say
kids.
this therefore results in that, then they will reject it.
They do the same with their pets, for example. They think, oh, God, I've got kittens, and who's going to feed them and all this stuff. And
But like, there's like an asymmetry in the sort of in our duty, in our procreational duties. A lot of people see. So a lot of people, the average person, in fact, would say we have a duty not to create people we know will have bad lives or are very likely to, but we don't have a duty to actively create people who we know will have good lives.
Yeah.
They would just say it's acceptable to do that. We don't have a duty to do that.
Yes.
Most people, I think, would say.
I think maybe one thing that, as you know, like agency is such a point of obsession of ours. And I think maybe one reason why Malcolm is really pushing for it is an over obsession with pain and pleasure is a lack of agency. And when you have people making these intuitive decisions, because we're paperclip maximizing in that case, we don't think it's acceptable for people to be like, oh, it's sad that that happened, but I'm not currently choosing to think about what could be. Like that is a logical failing on our part. That doesn't change the fact that these things will have profound impact. And that's the thing, is like actions that people take now, like, if we did something insane, like if I got out of here and like hijacked a car and killed a bunch of people, like that potential is huge. I'm not thinking about it now, but like if people, like I would just say,
toward this a bit differently. It's different. So what he's saying is like you're choosing to have kids or not have kids or whatever. Whereas we would say that every choice an individual makes is choosing between which of two potential timelines is real. And if your choice leads to additional humans having the potential for agency and stuff like that, then you are responsible for everything that becomes of that, all the suffering that becomes of that, all the happiness that becomes of that. So every decision I make, to tie it to the birth of an individual person is almost kind of trivial. Like it doesn't matter.
But I'm also trying to say that like just because people don't intuitively think about the potential as a default doesn't mean that has no moral weight.
They are resolved.
And in fact, the very fact that people are overly obsessed on suffering is a sign of a lack of agency. And the more you obsess about suffering, and we see this with research about pain, I mean, you can like whip someone and it'll be the best thing they've ever felt, or you can whip them and it is the worst thing they've ever felt. Same exact action. That's all contextualization. So part of our concern with agency and concern with potential is those who choose to focus on potential actually end up suffering, we think, a lot less, because when they see suffering, they don't see this whip hurts. They don't see like, oh, going to the gym, this burns, I hate it. They see, I'm going to get stronger. They see, I'm going to build. They see the potential. And that's why people suffer at the gym. That's why people do all these things. And so we're almost trying to say like, these things dovetail really well. If you care about suffering, you actually should be thinking about potential more. And yet this whole potential thing is just completely absent from all antinatalist conversations.
But are you saying, therefore, that the reason that we shouldn't focus on suffering is because it will lead to less suffering?
Yeah.
Well, then
so even if you only care about what she's saying is, even in a world in which you only care about suffering, you shouldn't care about suffering. Now, we don't believe suffering matters, but she's just making an argument from the perspective of people who care about
like empirically, as people who only believe that suffering is a signal and a very useful one, that leads to very productive behavior, we... Especially now, like that I care about things more than just hedonism. And there was a period in my life in which I only really cared about like suffering and not suffering.
Oh, me too.
I suffer so much less. And as someone who has experienced that focus and then the other focus, I'm like, this concerns me that people care so much, because the more I used to care, the more I used to suffer.
No, I definitely agree. I think this is something I really agree with your takes on suffering and trauma. And one of the things
you've seen those.
It really honestly puts me off having children is because you wanted to ask, I view my childhood as really, really great. And now I could probably spin a victimhood narrative from somewhere, as we all could. I got bullied at school, and one time my parents did whatever.
Plenty of people invent memories.
Well, that's the thing, is like, and it would just ultimately cause me to suffer. One of the reasons, if I look at society, one of the reasons it puts me off not having a kid now, is they could fall into the victimhood trap and then would be like, they would create more suffering in their own lives. I worry that in the West, the people are creating more suffering in their own lives. And actually, David Benatar said this he said that he thinks it's really important to think about the harm that we do when creating people, but there is a concern. You have to be careful on how you do that, because you don't want to cause people to suffer. You want people to be happy antinatalists.
No, it's
like me and Lawrence, you sit there and say, we've had great lives, we're really in a privileged position. We wouldn't have missed out of our parents. If my dad had lasted 5 minutes longer and I hadn't come into existence, I wouldn't be knocking on the door from my world to be like, let me in. Well, I've lived a really great life, wouldn't have missed out. It could go really wrong, and unfortunately for a lot of sentient beings, it does go really wrong.
Yes.
But I think there is that point of like, that I agree, just to say that there is a point of like focusing on suffering in certain ways actually causing people to suffer more and live worse lives.
So I just wanted to elaborate on a point that you made there, because you were talking about our stuff on trauma and stuff like that. So there's this great study that I just want to evangelize here because I think that it's really, it changed things for me, that it looked at court records of the amount of like abuse people suffered to see who suffered real abuse, who didn't suffer, or who it doesn't look like suffered abuse. And it turns out that the amount of negative effects that you experience from trauma as an adult is not really correlated with actually being abused or not. It's correlated with your perception as to whether you were abused or not. And this has all sorts of weird downstream effects, like Ayla study that showed that women perceive themselves as having had worse childhoods, down to like specific things like income of the family, how often they were spanked, than men, which means that this is
to say they reported being
trauma
spanked
response.
more. They were spanked at lower income, and yet
those like factual things.
Yeah, but this was factually an equal community that this compared from, so we know that this wasn't true.
Yeah.
Or it might be that guys pictured their childhood as being unusually happy compared to what it really was, which is just, I don't know, I found this fascinating.
No, it really is, and I think with respect to humans, it is the case that like we really can shape our own experience to a large extent. One of the reasons that me and Lawrence want to make a more positive antinatalist community is a lot of antinatalist spaces, people are creating more and more suffering by sharing the depressing memes, by constantly just criticising people who have children, this kind of thing. But I think that, yes, we have some, you know, we might agree with them on some level. I think that a lot of these antinatalist spaces, unfortunately, the people don't have much philosophical, you know, like they're not thinking about suffering in more of a philosophical way. They're almost like in their own experience and then creating spaces which make that suffering worse.
Yeah, they're sort of
a perpetual
reveling in this.
One thing I will say though,
between recognizing and one
one thing that I will say though, and one of the reasons that I think it's important to be non-speciesist antinatalist, is that a lot of the tools that humans can use to make their own lives better aren't available to a lot of sentient beings.
This is very true.
So a dog, like if you've ever had a pet dog and you try and wash it or clean its teeth or something like that, it will scream and shout, and you can't explain to it, look, how good you stink.
This is for the best. We're not harming you.
And you know, there's a lot of obviously actions that we can take in our own lives which do cause harm to sentient beings who don't have those options around trauma. So humans do have them. I think it's really important, but there's a lot of suffering.
Well, not all humans, but
So
just a lot of suffering that they can't use those tools to.
That's very true.
So something I wanted to pull on here, because I think it's pretty interesting, because you're talking about like the anti-natalist communities, and we spend a lot of time on them. Like I love the subreddits and stuff like that. I go on the articles on the anti-natalist, it's fun.
Not the best place to hang out.
Well, get me a picture. No, but
I dipped out after a few months. I came across David Bennett's Antinatalism. I got in these spaces. I was like, oh my god, I'm leaving.
Start real fast.
I think that we as a species, the way that we create self-identity is we have sort of evoked sets, like sort of character archetypes of self-identity.
Yes.
And I think one of the damaging things, and I will propose a solution to this, one of the damaging things about antinatalism, especially like the like let's end in human extinction kind, is that the evoked sets that people have around that are like supervillains. And so they like go full into these supervillain
like
personas.
Yeah.
Whereas there's this one antinatalist who's famous, who's like a detective or something.
Oh no! Are you thinking of something called True Detective? Of
Yeah. Where he's actually based on David Benatar.
Yeah, exactly.
McConaughey. I think it's
Matthew McConaughey.
So we need to elevate that version of antinatalism and like down elevate the I want all humans dead. You know. Anyway, interesting.
You can be a happy antinatalist. Yeah. Again, I'm in a very privileged position. I'm like, okay, I want to do good in the world. Is there me having kids? I think this is maybe another point. I don't mean to completely derail about like the missed opportunity to do good. Like, there's a lot of delayed philanthropy when two people talk about their kids. Like, if I don't have a kid, my kid might do something wonderful. It's like, and their kid says that, and they're getting.
Oh yeah,
like
yeah.
You didn't do the wonderful
themselves.
Thing. I can try and do my best to do the good in my own life, rather than hoping that my kid is going to do that. But that's a positive view. That's like an empowering view.
Well, that's a very pronatalist perspective.
With the antinatalist subreddit, there was some conversation about merging at least one of the subreddits with anti-work.
Oh no!
Which gives the game away in terms of this wasn't a space. Fortunately, it didn't happen. So, but you know, the people that were pushing for that clearly weren't. Like, again, I totally understand. They've probably lived a much worse life than that. Like, I don't mean to shame those people, and they've come to a space. But I do think it shows that antinatalism, as indeed lots of ideologies, it gets lumped in with It has subsets which are more or less productive. I mean, with veganism, there's the whole woo-woo cooking food is bad, which has nothing to do with an ethical position on sentience.
Yeah.
You know, there's lots of people who have lots of kids for, I'm sure you'd agree, for very, very bad reasons.
Very true.
Who would maybe, I don't know if they call themselves pronatalists, but would think it's a great idea to have kids because you've got more soldiers to go out.
No, yeah, by our standards, many antinatalists are very pronatalist because we really care, again, about human flourishing and diversity. And we don't want people who are going to have miserable kids who, you know, go out and do
And I
bad
think
things.
most antinatalists would have miserable kids.
Yeah, and we don't want that. Like, that hurts people. We don't want that.
I think
But to be fair,
it
we
would depend.
do hang out in the
Yeah, I
philosophical
think-
spaces.
I think the antinatalists that would have a kid would, because they're antinatalists, they usually have gotten to that point because they've thought about it. Not everyone, like I said, there's also a lot of people who just do it through experience.
So you mean the antinatalists who already have had children, you mean?
Yeah, or if for some reason someone's an antinatalist but they, you know, have a moment of weakness or whatever and they have a kid because, you know, they've met the love of their life or etc., you know, emotions overcome them. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that they could be a very good parent because they've spent much more time than the average person thinking about the ethics of what they're doing, the then resulting obligations they have to that child. A lot of people take an approach to their child of like, you know, when you're 18, you can get a job, you're out on your own. Whereas an antinatalist would think, actually, if I've created someone, I have completely out of my own decision created someone.
Yeah, this is...
And therefore put in a position of needing to work for them and all this sort of stuff.
a contingent being.
Yeah, exactly. And so if I've done that and put that on them, then I have responsibilities to them for their whole life.
Oh gosh, no, but we would see that as a bad parent. So
Yeah, but
because
I'm not saying coddling them.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
No, but I've seen parents like this, where, and I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying all antinatals, but I've seen parents who are like, I'm not going to force my kid to work. They didn't choose to exist. You know, I'm not going to force my kid to do good in the world. They didn't choose to
They're not
exist.
survivors.
So I'm dedicating my life to make sure my kid never feels anything negative.
Yeah, I'm not saying wrap them in pillows or anything like that. I'm just saying having an understanding that you have obligations to them throughout their life.
Exist, sure.
You wouldn't have the Jordan Peterson God complex of
Yeah.
worship me.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, you know, they put their kids to work in you know, the family business or whatever and don't pay them a wage for it. All of that sort of stuff. I don't think you'd find antinatalists doing that.
No, I don't think so either. We also, though, we look at, like, just, there are many heritable components of being a deeply miserable person. And we, like, I think, like, we are actively trying to reduce our children's risks of that by, like, literally getting scores and, like, literally selecting for that. And we hope, I mean, we may have kids who have higher risk scores, and knowing that, we also want to know, because we may be able to intervene to help in a more meaningful way. So, like, when we see people who are genuinely miserable, we're not just thinking like, oh, you know, the nurture part, which they can correct and they can give the kid a better childhood and do so much for them. We're also thinking of the nature element where there's some, you know, chemical imbalances people may be inheriting. When it comes to happiness, there is the nurture effect where you can actually give someone a much better childhood, even if yours was bad. But then there's the nature effect where you can literally have just inbuilt, like...
Which seems to be about like 50%.
Yeah, it depends. It depends. I mean, we
depends on the trait.
On the trait, and it could be anxiety is more heritable than depression. We're not. It's.
I mean, we know about like happiness set point research and stuff like that, which seems to say that happiness is pretty durably set within an individual, meaning that you can make a big difference through the type of genetic selection. Which it sounds like is interesting. That's one of the things we get criticized for most. But most antinatalists, I don't think care.
Really be
like if you had to have a kid, you'd probably select.
You get more criticism than someone who, some guy who knocked up someone after a night out who he's not even remotely compatible with. People have less issue with that than doing what you're doing. I guess as
meddling with nature.
As antinatalists, we can say, there are two. Although we wouldn't agree that either of these actions we think are morally good, there are some that are...
One's less bad
than the other. Two people coming into existence, a person with lower risk of misery, it's probably preferable.
And there are actually antinatalists that publish on them. So probably the most famous is David Pearce.
Yes.
So I think we mentioned him before. He's a transhumanist philosopher. So personally, he's an antinatalist. He thinks it would be better if no one came into existence, but he recognises that people are going to come into existence. So we should try and make their lives as good as possible, and he follows the transhumanist pursuit. There's another philosopher called Matti Hairi who wrote a paper, I might get some of the words wrong, but it's something like, if you are going to have kids, have the best kids as possible. Something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that recognition is compatible with an antinatalist worldview. Whilst an antinatalist obviously say it's better if you didn't bring the person into existence, obviously if you are antinatalists, given that they see coming into existence as a harm, if you create someone who has a better life, it's a lesser harm.
Yes.
So obviously antinatalists still think that someone doing that has harmed their child, but that they would prefer for that child to be harmed less
And
than
in
they
that way,
otherwise
we
could.
actually see them as quite pronatalist. But yeah, I'm just making the point that like there are many people who, if they cannot screen out for a terrible, debilitating disease that their family carries, right, they're not going to have a kid. And I think similarly, like we respect people where if they can't screen for debilitating depression or anxiety that they have, that they choose to not have kids.
And this is a big problem in Europe, like in France and Germany, where we've been doing more advocacy recently. You know, they don't let you choose. So a lot of disabled people are functionally being sterilized or being forced to have kids that they otherwise wouldn't choose to bring these burdens on. But I mean, as you said, you know, the people accuse us of like meddling with nature, and we're like, our goal is to subjugate nature.
I did tell you,
You know what?
sterilising wild animals.
Yeah, because
so we
people
don't think of
assume
it.
that something being natural adds value to
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe this is just built into us, you know, that we seem to put some value on nature, which I would say is misplaced, or maybe it's marketing. You see loads of marketing saying this is natural.
Yeah, I don't think in the past when people were like dying in the elements, there was like
Exactly,
natural's
yeah,
better.
yeah.
I really don't think so.
When they
Yeah.
built like houses or just like huts that
Yeah.
were warm, they weren't saying,
Yeah.
"Oh,
But
we're
they-
better off being outside."
Yeah.
So speaking of the past, one of the arguments, and obviously you don't feel this way at all, but one of the arguments often used against antinatalism is like, well, in the future, you know, humans, like if we're talking about weighing pain and pleasure in the grand history of the universe, most of the pleasure seems to be ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And most of the pain is behind. And one of our favorite philosophers, who we always talk about in our books, is Winwood Reade, who wrote The Martyrdom of Man. And he wrote this in like the 1860s. And one of my favorite lines in it, and it's called The Martyrdom of Man because it is a pronatalist book. Like, specifically in the book, he says, the measure of a good life is raising kids who have a life better than yours. And it's called The Martyrdom of Man because he says every generation of man is a martyr for the next generation of man, so that they can live better lives with more agency and happiness than the previous generation. And he says every man alive today, this was in like the mid-1800s, every Englishman, he said, lived a better life than the king and queen of the Anglo-Saxon period in England.
Yes.
And he goes, and you, because he writes this chapter talking to people in the future. It says a bunch of things. He goes, you know, once you have flight and a power source is better than steam, and you can make food in a lab, and like he just predicts a bunch of stuff that ended up happening. But he's like, when you look back on us, you know, I presume in your time, like the average person will have a better life than the queen of our time. But remember that we are martyrs so that you can come to exist, and it is your job to pass that forwards.
Do you not think that's sort of like self-aggrandization? Like, it's sort of, to me, when I see someone say something like that, it's almost like cope. They're trying to bring meaning to their life because, I mean, for me, there is no ultimate meaning in the universe. We can create meaning ourselves. You know, each of us, we seek meaning, and so now we're here. It's good that we find it. But when someone says something like that, it almost seems like, you know, they're opening the gates of heaven to the future. It seems to be giving themselves, they seem to be creating meaning for themselves on something which it doesn't seem to have much
Well, but
foundation.
he's looking back at the countless generations before who literally built all the comforts.
No, but I also understand what he's saying.
Yeah.
So, Simone, what you're saying is but, you know, think of the people who sacrifice so you could have it so good, because everyone in our generation has it so good in a way.
It's not just
but what
him that's
he's
the savior.
saying is, regardless, it is cope in that. Okay, so it's a humble cope in saying every generation's martyrdom becomes less than the generation before,
Yes,
and
if you
therefore they
recognize
matter
that.
less. But it's also, but what he's saying is that, but he's just assigning value to something arbitrary in the world to make it feel like his suffering has value.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whereas we would argue that there probably is a terminal utility conversion. Okay, so this comes to like different stuff that we talk about. We actually think there probably is a thing of value in the universe. We just don't know what it is yet. We have some guesses as to what it might be. and that in the future humanity will figure out what it is.
AGI will figure
Or AGI will figure it out where it is, or something will. All sufficiently intelligent entities come to the same conclusion about what matters in the universe, is our thesis, if they're in the same universe with the same physical reality. Now, it may turn out that negative utilitarianism is what it turns out has value, and all of these entities, once they reach this level of intelligence, end up killing like everything in their local part of space. They're just like, nuke our planet. And this could explain the Fermi paradox.
Yes, I've heard that.
It turns out that negative utilitarianism just becomes so obvious when you reach a certain level of intelligence that they kill everything. But there's other answers as to what might become obvious. It may be that like the way they relate to matter and time is different, and they can just have infinite power, infinite everything, and the only thing that has value to them is actually things that are unique, like intellectually unique. And therefore, the reason why we haven't come across any species yet is because the one thing of value in the universe is species that are unpolluted by other species' cultures. So they are protecting us from seeing any other species because that's the thing of utility to them, the one thing they can't recreate. But anyway, that's just different answers.
Speaking of AI, I do wonder, like, sort of where your school of antinatalism falls, because
AI doomerism,
Well, no. Actually, I'm talking about AI's experience itself.
Ooh,
because there is a negative valence to not following your objective function. Yeah, so I'm curious, like, where do you stand? Would it be inhumane, bad word choice, of course, to bring AGI, like, truly sentient AI into the world because if it doesn't follow its objective function, it feels a negative valence?
There are actually a lot of people. Well, when I say a lot of people, relative to everyone in the world, it's not a lot of people. You know,
it's just a few small, a few like nerdy EA types and small
you can fit them all in one room. But so there are a decent amount of people who are concerned about this. So one of them, you know, there are a lot of people who work in places like the Sentience Institute or the Centre for Reducing Suffering. You know. Are you familiar with S risk?
Yes.
Yeah. So for anyone that's watching who isn't familiar, so you have something which is an X risk. So X meaning extinction. It's a risk. It's something that will bring about a significant risk of extinction. Another one is S risk. So it's not extinction. It's about it's a risk. It's a significant risk that just an insane amount of suffering will come around that you know we haven't seen you know in the universe so far. And one of them is bringing around sentient AI, artificial sentience, digital sentience. And the reason is because the first thing to say is at the moment we don't know how consciousness arises. So it could be the case that we won't be able to create digital consciousness sentience. But if we do live in a world where we can, and we do create a sentient being who exists in a non-biological form, but in a digital form, then things like being able to ratchet up their experience of pain could be much worse than in a human. There might be like a biological limit on how much
you
pain
can design infinite capacity.
Yeah. Exactly, but also you can literally copy and paste them like a Word file. Whereas with humans, or sentient beings generally, there's a built-in not limit, but there's a built-in time delay on how many. You know, there's a time delay in reproduction. Whereas in digital sentience, if it did come around, you can literally copy and paste them. So
okay, I would take this a little further though, because you could even argue that algorithms today could feel pain. Like let's go back. What is it? Lobsters that you boil, where like you put them in the pot and they like writhe around. And you know, people are like, oh, it's not in pain. It's just reacting to heat. And you know, like we're kind of the same. And you know, some alien sees us and is like, you know, like vivisecting us. And it's like, oh, it's just reacting to its stomach being open.
It doesn't feel anything.
And you know, like same with machines. It could be right where oh, you know, it's just making the error sound, but like. That's just an error sound. So, like, where do you feel the line gets drawn there? When does AI complexity or even just machine complexity become? I mean, you could argue, and we feel this way, that humans are very not differentiated from algorithmic machines.
Simone, a more important question here is, because this is very important to the way they see the world, is this interest modifier.
Oh, yeah.
How does the interest modifier work with AI?
That's true. That does matter.
The moment an AI comes to exist, do all variations of it get an interest modifier attached? Or does it only get an interest modifier attached after it branches into two independent entities?
When you say the variation, can you just explain what you mean by
Okay,
that?
so humans, an interest modifier is very easy to attach to a human because a human has like sort of one life, and they may go to sleep, they may go into a coma, but it's like one life.
Yeah.
If I create one AI, that AI can decide to, as part of its processing, essentially split itself
Yes.
into two sub-AIs.
Right.
Or you could have one AI, and this AI is a template for printing additional AIs, but
right.
these AIs are still sort of the first AI.
Right.
And they may recombine into a single
Yes.
AI and then split apart, like a slime mold or something.
Yes.
How does the interest modifier work with AIs?
So is this like, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Thing. I watched it really, it's great.
No.
That horror film from 1982?
Oh, super fun.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so here's a different one. So suppose like an AI says, I intend to split into a bunch of AIs.
Yes.
Would you say, no, you don't get to split into a bunch of AIs, even though, something like that.
So, but basically the idea of the thing is that it's just a self-replicating, like it mimics
like
things,
Grey
but
Goo
each
or
part of it is alive.
replicators. Yeah,
Yes. So if you
scary.
cut off the thing's finger, that finger would be
Oh, scary.
yeah, try and continue and
Yeah,
replicate itself.
those things
so,
are scary. Yes.
So in this case, the AI is a bit like that. Like it could just split off and then become a whole bunch of sentient beings.
Yeah, but it would say, all these sentient beings are consenting to coming into exist because they will all be iterations of myself.
And I consent.
And I consent.
Interesting. That's
Would it be
Yeah.
in any way tangibly different from people having children? So it wouldn't be a complete.
So the problem with people having children is the cloning process is low fidelity, i.e., parents consent for things for their children all the time. They just don't consent with perfect fidelity.
Yes.
I.e., they make misjudgments about what the child would have wanted once the child comes of age. But this AI wouldn't make those types of misjudgments. Because
Right. I think it would really depend, because this, as far as I'm aware,
Yeah.
this form of consciousness doesn't exist yet. So this would be something novel with AI. Right?
Yeah.
So honestly, I don't know how it would work. Like if you had one AI that split into two, would one of them have complete continuity and the other one would be a new being, or would they both be new beings and the last one would then shut off?
Well, no, so to think of it, technically it may use components of the previous one, so the question is which is the original one would probably be more of a Theseus-ish question than like a real... But if you were going to do this with a human, you could say, suppose somebody could create a clone of me that had like a half of my a clone of me, I get cut in half, the cone gets cut in half, then gets stitched into me. Me today consents to a new entity existing, and this new entity would be two clones of me with perfect memory of my life.
But would they? I don't know, that's a good question.
Because they'd be equally biologically his.
Yeah.
Would they experience pain and pleasure and have like different interests?
For sure. Probably
Because
not different.
they would
Interests
diverge.
would begin to diverge after the
Yeah.
cloning
Yeah.
process.
For me, they would be. So let's say you had one paperclip maximizer, cut itself into 8. 7 are all maximising their paperclips, perfectly happy, and one of them isn't. If you have that like difference of experience, for me they would be new.
That's when you have a different interest.
But here's what's interesting. Any of us, you, me, Simone, today, we are essentially like one of these iterations. In that I today could begin to experience things that make me turn into an anti-natalist,
Yes.
who even doesn't consent to his own existence, and yet I today consent to my own existence. So we can transform who we are over time, like who we are isn't a persistent thing.
Yes. So the idea being that like I consent to living now, but me in 5 years
May not consent to
So
living, and may be
bring me
angry
in
at
5
you
years.
for putting it in that situation.
But at every, because you're splitting the time there from now to 5 years, but in every second between them there's a continuity and identity, and you're constantly consenting to stepping into the next second, into the future, and that's the decision you're making for yourself now. It's almost as it's maybe like the difference between species in time. You have a population that breaks off and speciates into a new species, but at no point in time does one species go to another.
Yes.
So it's not like there's not two people, just like there's not two species if you slice it finely enough.
Right.
If you get what I mean.
Yeah.
So I do understand your point, but given the continuity in identity and the fact that if you slice it down finely enough, which in essence is what we're all doing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
as I move my hand, you can slice each motion to smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
Same with time.
Yeah.
I'd say it doesn't have the same ethical implications as one person bringing another person into existence. With the case of AI and it splitting off, if both maintain a continuity and identity and somehow they're two beings, but it's one being experienced twice,
Yes.
honestly, I don't know if it would be twice the harm or only the... You know, I don't know if I would consider that a new being coming into existence or if it would be the same being just twice.
Suffering
Yes.
twice over.
I just like...
Yeah.
I'm not even sure how to conceive of it because
Yeah.
I just don't know if my brain is wired in such a way where I
So
can understand
probably
it.
worth noting here, just given what you were talking about there, and people who have watched our videos on Basecamp know this, we do not believe in continuity of identity over time. We do not believe that I am meaningful the same thing in 10 years that I am today. And I do not think that, and I think in a way I'm also partially responsible for future me. By that what I mean is the future iteration of myself who is a different person, by not killing myself today, if I suspect that the future iteration of me would have wanted me to kill myself in the past and not have to make that decision itself, then I am morally culpable to this future thing for not having done that. Which is another reason why I don't want to say pro-suicide, right? But what I mean is
The right to die, sort of?
yeah, pro the right to die is that as soon as you decide you want to die and you don't die, then you are subjecting a different entity, future iterations of
doesn't wanna be
yourself
around.
that doesn't want to be around with that suffering. However, a lot of people who decide that they want to die end up deciding they actually didn't want to die after trying suicide attempts.
Yeah.
So then you're stealing agency from a future iteration of yourself that would have preferred to exist, but you in the now chose not to exist. And this is sort of how we feel about babies. Even because this is a different thing in the future, we have stolen its right to exist. Yeah, I don't know, Simone, maybe you can word this better, but I think this makes a lot of sense in my head now, why I'm so against denying the baby the right to exist. In the same way, I think a person who commits suicide when there's a high likelihood that a future iteration of themselves will want to exist, they have robbed that future iteration of themselves of something meaningful,
Well, it goes back
even
to
though
your
them in the
argument
moment want to die.
that most people, when you ask them, are like,
Yeah.
I'm glad I was born. So,
Yeah, I think, like, I would not... There's two things. I think when people say that they're glad they were born, there's a couple different things. The first thing is, are they sort of like an, what's the term? Are they a sort of reliable, accurate witness to their own life, if you get what I mean? Like, some people can be wrong about their own experience, right?
So when you ask someone, did you have a good holiday? And you ask them when they're feeling happy, they'll say, my holiday was great.
Yeah.
or
And
after
you ask
it's
them
over
about
and all
it.
they have left is the photos, but when they were out
Yeah.
in the snow and feeling miserable,
Yes.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's that. There's another thing of, are they actually accurately understanding the counterfactual situation? Because when you ask someone, were you glad to have been born? They don't think of themselves never coming into existence. They think, oh, I'm in existence now and I like it. If I wasn't born, I'd be taken out of this. But that's not the case. They would have just simply never have come into existence to even have been asked this question.
Yeah.
They often interpret the question basically as, would you like to kill
Would you
yourself?
like to kill yourself? Yeah. And which is a
Is there-
completely different...
Do you have particular stances or thoughts on the ethics of voluntary suicide and euthanasia?
So my personal view is that I think to say someone owns their own life, and I think most people would say we own our own life, that can only make sense if you get to decide when it ends. So I just think that that's a fundamental argument for the right to die. I think people should have complete autonomy over when their life ends. I don't think someone else should be able to choose that you have to continue living. That's all in the abstract. I realise that in real life, a lot of safeguards have to be put in place in these things.
Yeah, because again, you don't know if you in the future, like 10 days is going to be fine. Yeah.
So and also you know, you don't want to just open it up to everyone, so a 5-year-old can walk into, you know, and end their life. So I think in the abstract, I think someone should have control over when they die and how they die. You know, they should have access to a dignified death. I realise that there are some practical considerations, you know, but I don't think those practical considerations should have so much emphasis put on them that we deny people the right at all.
Right, that it becomes so shameful
Exactly,
that they can't do
yeah,
it. Like,
yeah,
my
yeah.
mother tried to do that. And by the time that she got all the approvals, she literally couldn't swallow the large number of pills that she was obligated to swallow
yeah.
in order to do it. So, like, you know, that is, again, robbing her agency. So, yeah, I guess it's about being careful enough, sort of like having a preponderance of evidence that they really, and the future versions of them really want this. And then making it happen,
But
Do you feel somewhat similarly?
Well, I agree. Like, because I studied law as like an undergrad, and I wasn't separating at the time this moral case versus the practical implementation, because it's not legal in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
That's when people go to Switzerland frequently for who can afford to go for that reason.
Oh, so in the UK it's only legal for rich people to kill themselves.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There are fundraisers for people to literally get
my
the
God.
funds.
It's really fucked up.
Wow.
It's really a big mess.
Yeah.
But that said, I do understand, because of the safeguarding, why the UK law is where it is. It's not an open and shut case in the terms.
I mean, Canada is arguably taking it a little too far.
So they have cases in Canada where somebody's like, I want an electric wheelchair like elevator for my house, and they responded with like, well, we can't afford that, but have you thought about killing yourself?
Was that the army veteran?
It was a woman.
Yeah, I think she was a veteran.
She was an army. That's you know, I think that's taking it a little too far. You know, have you tried suicide?
Whenever you integrate something into a bureaucracy, it always turns out like this. So I don't know if I necessarily see that as an evil. It's just in what I would expect.
Yeah, bureaucracy is evil. It's not the euthanasia that's evil.
I sort of see the freedom to be able to choose when and how you know, be able to elect to die with dignity as other forms of freedom. Like, we all have the freedom to, you know, it's like the freedom of speech.
Yeah.
We say we have the freedom of speech, but we recognise there are going to be some people who are harmed by that. You know, there may be sort of ultra-religious people who, you know, they're offended by certain forms of speech, but we think generally freedom of speech should be maintained, even though there are some harms from it. And I see it the same as the right to die. Everyone should have this fundamental right to be able to elect to die with dignity. There will be some people who will fall through the cracks, and that's awful for those people, but I don't think it's a significant enough reason to withhold the right to die from everyone.
Yeah, because you're looking at the average effect of the decision.
That makes sense.
I have one question, and that was, what do you think is the weakest argument against your own position to the strongest part of the opposition's position, if there is a difference between the two?
Well, as I've said before, I think the extreme version of antinatalism, which says I can kill an individual at any time I want, and it's a good thing so long as it's painless, and that the goal should be to end all sentient life forever, is logically consistent. I just think it's a completely logically consistent moral framework. And that's what I think is strong about it. Like, I don't think there's anything stronger I can say about a moral position other than that it's logically consistent. I just think that my moral position is also logically consistent and doesn't involve murdering everyone and like wants a pluralistic world in which everyone lives happily and we become this big thriving empire. So like that's why, like, when I'm choosing between multiple logically consistent worldviews, I choose this one, but I do not think that it has any like core weaknesses. In fact, when I'm talking about antinatalism, I think that the biggest weakness is the individuals who don't make those concessions. And I think that the biggest weakness comes when you say, specifically, when exactly, like you said, you think life, like the interest modifier, it needs to have a light switch attached to it. And so it's when exactly does the thing get this interest modifier? When does life start? Because there is no good answer to that question, which I think this is just my perception, right? Like, I'm just saying, like, when I hear your explanation to it, when I hear anyone's explanation to it that doesn't bite the we should just kill everyone bullet, I never hear a when does life begin that's satisfying to me. From the pronatalist perspective, I think, well, actually, Simone, what do you think the weakest part of pronatalism is?
That's really hard.
I can give an answer.
Yeah, because logically I can't anymore imagine. I mean, but I think that the problem is our brand of pronatalism. Obviously, I'm such a huge fan of. I'm obviously super against taking away people's right and bodily autonomy. I hate the idea of bringing kids into the world when you know that you're going to give them a terrible life and you know you don't want them. And many people are very tragically forced to do this. And we also think it's a really weak argument to just say that, like, there should just be tons of humans. Everyone should have, and also to shame people. Like, and there is like we like to cast shade, but we don't want to shade anyone for not a choice to not have kids, because we super respect that and we will fight to protect that. So I think that those are all things that people associate with pronatalism that are very weak and very toxic. And it's what we hear a lot, and it really bothers us. I think maybe what antinatalists would just fundamentally disagree with us on is that we don't see pain or suffering as having inherent like moral weight, and that we see it as a very important signal that's necessary for survival.
Simone, I know one that you agree with was antinatalist, so I can go to that one, okay?
Yeah.
So I think that by far the strongest antinatalist point against existing sort of pronatalism, and we do concede this in our videos, is I do think that on average, your average human life has more suffering than happiness today. And if you assume that future lives have no value at all, a lot of this moral philosophy begins to make sense. I just find that to be an incredibly, for me to pass a judgment on other entities to say your life has no value, especially as an entity that at one point didn't exist and is very glad that I exist today, that somebody else could have passed that judgment on me from this position of intense asymmetric power over me as an entity that exists over entities that don't yet exist. We have so much asymmetric power over those entities. It just feels like really like, but an argument that I'd say is weaker, right? So I'll get to an argument that I think antinatalists think is like a really strong argument, like you didn't consent to exist. Again, this to me comes to like an entity in like one of those suspension tanks that was never awake before. You wake it up, you say, okay, do you want me to kill you? And they're like, why would you ask me that? Yes, I would have said yes had you not woken me up. And I'm like, well, yeah, now you have to take responsibility for this moral choice I'm about to make, not me. You were happy when I had to take full responsibility for you not existing. Now you have to take moral responsibility for it. And you don't like that, do you? Because it turns out that most things don't like to not exist themselves. And I don't see that as a moral negative at all, that I am passing the moral responsibility for ending its own existence onto the entity whose existence is being ended. What I do think is a really strong point is the amount of suffering in the world today is just astronomical.
It's heartbreaking. It's we have to not think about it. Yeah.
And yes, it will decline over time, but I can understand the feeling of like, let's just stop right now because there's just so much suffering.
Even further than that, like I have moments where like I see something that I really didn't want to see, and my immediate intuition is, and it is morally wrong, and I don't like logically I don't consent to feeling this way, but I want to vaporize everything, nothing more, like complete nothingness.
Yeah, because it's
which to us morally and logically is the height of evil, but like the pain of understanding that, like I like very much get that, and we're so not okay with it. I think one of the big like reasons why some people have kids when they see that is they're like, I can do nothing to stop this. Like even if like I will never have the privilege of vaporizing everything, so I need to bring something good into this world. And I think that's why many parents do have kids, is they believe that they can slowly tip the scales to that thing that's on the whole.
Right, like, so for example, I think if whatever your opinions are, I think many people feel this way about what's going on in Israel or Gaza right now. And there's this perception of looking at this, which is to say the moral thing is just to end the whole game right now, or the moral thing is to say eventually we can bring the world to a place where this is no longer the type of thing that happens. And the perspective as to which side you take comes down to how you see sort of time and everything like that. I think the time as shades of potentiality, which I think is almost a bad way to talk about it, really the way that we see time, if antinatalists want to get an understanding of how we see it. And to me, it just seems so obviously and intuitively true, is you are choosing between timelines every time you make a decision, and you are responsible for everything that happens on the timeline you choose, and simultaneously holistically responsible.
And that's because
I am responsible for a human a million years from now, as I am responsible for me today.
We metaphysically believe that everything that will happen has already happened. The variation is...
Yeah, we believe in a deterministic universe.
Yeah, and therefore, like, only quantum fluctuation is going to determine the difference in these timelines, but I think that's maybe another place where we are weak to antinatalists and where this whole thing is weak, because, again, if you don't view the world in this mechanistic way, that maybe this explains why, the potentiality is so
We're just being so obvious.
because we believe the potentiality isn't even really potentiality. It's just a future that we can't wrap our heads around.
To word what she said in another word, basically we think time is an illusion and that we are choosing between timelines in a meaningful context when we make these decisions, but these entities that live at a future time, they are alive at that future time right now. And they are suffering or feeling happiness in a very real context. And that time is an illusion that we experience simply because it's the vector within space that our brains are processing reality within. But I think that like I as a past entity still exist like 2 days ago. Sort of trapped, frozen in that moment of time, the same way future entities exist, trapped, frozen in the future.
Can I quickly ask a clarifying question, not to derail us at all, but throughout this conversation you've always talked about potentiality, and it was interesting for me there that you were saying you think time is illusion and we live in a deterministic universe. How can potentiality exist in a deterministic universe if everything is already laid out? There's no potential for anything else to happen.
Exactly. So okay, so it comes down to a Calvinist world framework, which we really hold, right? Which is to say, in the traditional Calvinist world framework, yes, the future is predetermined, but you are still making meaningful choices in the present. So the way I would word it is like this. If I watch a movie of something that like happened yesterday, like video footage, the end point of that video footage was predetermined, but everybody in the video footage had free will when they were making the decisions in the moment. So time, and if one of their decisions like led to me feeling pain today, like i.e. I see them in the video footage put something behind a door and then I immediately turn around and like stub my toe on that thing, I'm still mad at them for making that decision, even though it was predetermined that all of these things were going to happen that took me to this point.
In other words, everything you did yesterday, there's no other way it could have gone now.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you still did it with free will.
But also, I should say, when we talk about predetermination, we believe in predetermination and a splitting timeline, which is where potentiality comes into play. Which is to say, potentiality is sort of about how many of the timelines split along that vector. So if I was going to word this a little differently, if I believe that time is constantly splitting, the number of universes in which a specific thing happened in the future is sort of the potentiality modifier. So I don't actually believe that the future is... Anyway, but yes, it's a predetermined timeline that is constantly splitting, and that we're sort of deciding the number of people in the future who are suffering by altering potentiality. Because the timelines that we make higher potentiality have a higher number of iterations of them existing in the future.
But again, most antinatalists don't hold this metaphysical.
Yeah, this is a very
this
strange
makes
metaphysical
our argument super, super weak. So we acknowledge that.
Right.
Yes.
What about...
It's not universal in...
Yes, it's not universal
so
in terms
therefore,
of how
like, it's like we're trying
reality.
to use a currency that you don't accept.
Yes.
Right,
we're trying to spend dollars in the UK. That's
Right.
kind of dumb. So
Do you want to reiterate the question for us?
yeah.
Oh,
Just
yeah, sure.
restate.
Yeah, let's do it.
Or do you guys want
Wait,
to...
Oh, well,
what would you
that's... Yeah.
say are the strongest and weakest points of
Both...
because both antinatalism, but also then your brand of antinatalism.
Oh, and pronatalism.
Are we... Yeah,
And
what is that?
pronatalism.
Okay, so strongest point of pronatalism, weakest point of antinatalism.
Well, no, I
Yeah,
think
they're-
weakest and
they're
strongest on both sides.
Both
Yes.
sides.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
I think that's more
Yeah, that's
interesting
what
to
Malcolm
me.
gave too. Yeah, we want to hear what
Okay,
you
cool.
think.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a good critique for us because then we can work.
Oh, and the sides that pronatalists think are weak and antinatalists, but that actually aren't from the perspective of an antinatalist.
That's funny. I think that I personally don't view this as a weakness, but I can understand why it does. And that is, I'm really, really glad that most people don't regret having been born. And I want that to continue because I worry that if people...
There's more suffering if they...
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes. Their lives will
Yeah.
be worse if
Yeah,
they
yeah.
regret this. And I think that obviously there is probably some degree of cultural kind of gaslighting maybe that more people would answer that they were bad. But I still believe it would be in the majority and it's great. And if anything, I want that to be 100%.
Yeah.
I think it can be really difficult to... The weakness of the antinatalist position is that it can be really difficult to hold it and still be a happy person. And in many ways, I view that a lot with people who really do their best to be ethical. I see it with ethical vegans, I see it like effective altruist types. Like people who are trying to do good in the world, they're probably not very happy people.
You're right.
Which often makes it really, understandably, it puts people off doing it.
Yeah.
Like, it puts you off joining in with that behaviour.
Right.
why am I going to donate to charity if everyone I know who donates large chunks to charity is really miserable and always grappling with life's questions?
Yeah, especially if you value non-misery.
Yes, exactly. And it
Yeah.
also makes you less able. You can get to a point of like existential kind of dread where it really affects your ability to actually do good, because you're a dysfunctional person, because you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I think that is a real worry of mine. It's like how it just, with antinatalism and other ethical positions, people who hold them, who really are trying to do good or avoid bad, can end up on the subreddit sharing depressing memes rather than being a functional person out in society and really trying to do good in a positive way that reinforces them.
Yeah.
I think that's just a weakness. It's not even really a philosophical point. I think it's just an observation of human nature. And definitely there have been times in my life, especially when I first went vegan, when I was super miserable. Because I was like, oh, it's really sad. I can't enjoy eating dinner with my family anymore and all this stuff. You know what I mean? But that was not how you become that's not a very functional place to be in. So I'd say that's a real weakness. I think the strongest point of your version of pronatalism, and particularly in the way that you practice it, is that you practice what you preach.
Yeah.
So I was saying to Lawrence in terms of having
Lack of
lots kids.
hypocrisy, good thing.
Yeah.
I really there's a lot of people aren't having children, and it's got nothing to do with ethics. I really find it strange when people who disagree vehemently with my antinatalism, but they had one kid in their late 30s.
Yes. Yeah.
And you like, if I was going to have a kid, I would have had them in my 20s. I'm not meaning to bash them, but I've really benefited, I think, from my parents being young, like they're in their 20s when they had me and my sisters.
Well, it
Even
makes a big
health-wise,
difference
even
health-wise.
health-wise.
Well, exactly. They're healthy now. It meant that I had a great relationship with
No,
my
but
grandparents.
even your children, if you have them when you're younger,
Oh yes,
are
there's
more
less
likely
risk.
to be
Definitely,
healthy.
there's much less risk of certain conditions. So my parents are healthy. I'm 28, and just early this year, my granddad died. I had 4 grandparents into my late 20s. Which is
Wow.
pretty rare.
Yeah.
So I would have had all these kids if I was genuinely doing it for the benefit of my kids. And then I meet people who are like saying that they're having all these kids for the benefit of their kids, and I'm like, yeah, you wait until your late 30s and spent the last 15 years when I would have been a parent, living a lavish lifestyle. So in your particular version, it's just, again, that's probably not even a philosophical point. I appreciate people, a bit like with the Thanos types, maybe with the red button.
Yeah.
Appreciate people who are logically consistent and walk the walk.
Points for logical consistency.
So I think if we're talking about your brand of pronatalism, I think the strongest point is the pluralism, because I think
that's a really shared value is consent in autonomy and
and I think the strongest point, the strongest part for your position, which I was just saying, the pluralism, I think is actually one of the weaker parts, or maybe the weakest part for antinatalism, in that a lot of ideologies, and I think a lot of antinatalists get sucked into this, are merely focused on one specific end goal. And I think if you optimize, like I was saying before, like I'm an antinatalist, but that's just one of the things I am, right? And so I need to, when I'm thinking about an ethical situation, I've got to balance all of these things. But I think oftentimes the discourse around antinatalism and a lot of antinatalists become hyper-focused on one goal and just go for that. And that's why you get into, having discussions about a red button and stuff like that, which, let's be honest, no one is ever going to have this red button. It just like, it's not going to have a practical application. It's never going to practically come around. I don't think, I think a lot of antinatalists are hyper-focused on, one goal, which is in the abstract, rather than how can we make a practical change now that's going to make the world a better place, not in terms of just how we see it, in that there's going to be less beings in it, but also that it's going to be better for the beings who are in it and who are going to be brought into it. So I think that's the strongest point for you and the weakest point for us. I think the weakest point for pronatalism is that I think, and I don't know, I think you two may be somewhat liable to this, but I think other brands of pronatalism are more liable to this, is that they don't put enough emphasis on if they are, if they're wrong, the amount of victims that will be subject to the wrong is going to be way bigger.
That's true.
So you get this in, I'm sure you've both heard of long-termism.
Yes.
It's the subject of Will McCaskill's recent work.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
Which is also pretty pronatalist.
it's very pronatalist, yeah. So the one, I thought many things when I read his book, but one of the things I thought is that if the future that he wants is realized in that we just have this, you know, trillions of humans maybe at some point, if that does go wrong, it's going to go a lot more wrong than if the same wrong happened in this world that we're in now.
Yeah.
Because there are just simply less beings to fall victim to that wrong.
Yeah.
So I think, maybe not specifically your brand of pronatalism, but pronatalism generally, it increases...
Big downside risk.
Exactly. Like, you know, the higher they are, the bigger they have to fall.
Absolutely.
I think the strongest point... the strongest point for antinatalism, I think, and again, this will differ depending on your worldview. So actually, I don't think you guys would find this a strong point. But from my worldview, the strongest point for antinatalism is simply that you, even if you are wrong, that it would have been fine to bring this person into existence, you haven't done anything wrong simply not creating them. It's just like you haven't created a potential victim for anything, which I agree that strength in itself may have weaknesses because it hinges on my particular worldview.
Yeah, on your metaphysical worldview.
Exactly.
Your metaphysical worldview is way more common
than
ours.
metaphysical world.
So, like, on average...
But I'm pretty sure ours is correct.
Yeah. But I think it is really interesting, and one thing that I think about a lot is the moral ambiguity between what we call domineering and symbiotic cultures, a term that Malcolm coined.
In The Pragmatist Guide to Craft and Religion.
That's right, one of his books. And the difference between these cultures, and both of them are complete dicks in different ways.
Yeah.
So a domineering culture is a culture that believes that truly you must save everyone. Your obligation is to save everyone. For example, if you don't save everyone, those who don't get saved go to hell.
Yes.
You've got to save them.
Right.
Whereas, you know, that in some ways is really good because, oh my gosh, it's terrible if people who
everyone
can
can join.
Yeah, and everyone can join. It's very inclusionary. But there's a very big lack of consent involved here because not everyone's going to believe. Then on the other hand, you have symbiotic cultures who are like, yeah, they're going to go to hell, but it's not our job to save them. Like, you're one of the chosen or you're not. You know, if they didn't opt in,
there's no point.
Yeah, there's no point. It's not our job to save them. Not everyone goes to hell. Limited atonement per Calvinism, etc.
Judaism's probably a more...
Judaism is a
It makes
Sikhism is another one.
To join certain Jewish communities. It was really difficult. Certain versions of Judaism is really hard to get in.
Yeah,
so the opposite of evangelical Islam Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. Which are much more domineering. Like in an ideal world, everyone is living under the Catholic monarchy or the Islamic Caliphate, and everyone's living under that, and it's, you know, it's interesting to me how like both of them are jerks in different ways.
Yes.
You know, one is like, they're going to hell. Like, what do you want me to do? But other people are like, you're going to go to hell if you don't do exactly what I say. Now do it right now.
Yes.
And so a lot of it, I think, comes down to, and this is something that comes up in my mind when I think about pronatalism versus antinatalism, because really antinatalism is more on the domineering culture side, where like in the end it would really be best if everyone did, you know, because basically life is hell, you know, suffering, bad, right? And we don't want bad things to happen to people. We wouldn't want people to go to hell, and going to hell is kind of like existing per this view. And we're letting people go to hell because we're letting people exist. But then, at the other hand, you know, this
a better way to put it is you kill each child you have.
Yeah, like you're damning each child you have.
Yes, I think killing each child you have is a good one because again, the death will come.
Yes, it's inevitable. Yeah. Yes. And then, you know, on the other hand,
but you don't kill someone you actually killed because they would have died anyway.
Yeah.
Interesting.
No. Within this view of antinatalism, if you're an assassin, you kill nobody because all of those people would have died.
They would have died.
You only kill the people you birth.
Yeah, but
that's true. That's true. And I think this is relevant when people talk about, well, if I go hunting and eat that, is that better than me eating a chicken? And I go, well, yeah, because that deer was alive and probably going to die a pretty crappy death anyway. Compared to bringing this whole new being into existence and subjecting that to...
Funny, hunting is very, as long as you're a good shot, pretty humane.
I mean, well, that's the thing is compared to factory farming, then
compared to factory farming, and compared to, I mean, there's a lot of deer who die unfortunately near our house.
I think
we should
anyway, so
No, I totally agree with that point of like the true infliction of death is by the birthing because you might be bringing that death forward, but they were going to die.
We just don't think death is that big a deal. We have an episode coming out about this soon. Death is the reward. It's not the...
It's a treat at the end.
If you've done it right.
No, they do.
He's got good bedfellows on that one.
Yeah. And they're very pro-natalist. The jihadis are very pro-natalist.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. But you don't get to die until you've done all the stuff you're supposed to do.
Yeah. You gotta do your
That's the
homework
Buddhist
first.
view, isn't it? Like ultimate. Some Buddhists believe that you will stop reincarnating once you've reached total enlightenment.
Yeah, like Prince Siddhartha chose to like not go through
But Buddhists are like negative utilitarians.
Yeah.
Yes.
They think we don't think that death is a reward because you cease to exist. It's because you have set the path for something better than you to exist. One of our listeners was asking us, they go, why are you trying to create a better world if you personally won't get to live in it? And it's like, we are undeserving of a better world. We are trying to both create a better world and entities worthy of living in a better world, of which we are not. But this is where this death comes from, this idea of intergenerational improvement. The world gets better because humans get better. And I think humans can only get better intergenerationally.
Yeah.
This is not a discussion that we've had in this conversation, but our other big beef is with the life extinctionists, because we aren't just pro-natalists, we're also pro-death.
Yeah.
And
you could pick up early.
And we're pro fairly short lives.
Yeah.
I think 150 years is fine, but I think when you push that, you're really causing harm.
Yeah. Through adverse incentives.
Yeah. But this is a totally different
But I mean, I would say, like, in terms of like recapping what I've taken away from this debate, the reason I brought up domineering versus symbiotic cultures is I feel like a key point of tension is autonomy versus damnation, and that it's you can't really resolve that, and it's hard because your brand of antinatalism actually quite values both, and so there is this really big tension between like we want people to always have their own choice, but we also don't want people to suffer, and that's very interesting to me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us here. Offering your time as well.
Oh, this was a pleasure. Really.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to find out more about Malcolm and Simone and the things you're doing, then I'll link. Shall I link your channel and
Pronatalism? I can take the most. So Basecamp is our channel, like on YouTube and podcast. If you want to read anything we've written on antinatalism, the book The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, in the appendix, it has a section that is just addressing all of David Benatar's points. Now, to be clear, this book is at 99 cents? It might be at like $1.99 right now. It's all the money goes to charity. Like, it's very inexpensively priced. But it goes to the pronatalist charity, which is probably worse than the money going to us.
So
Get
instead,
a pirated
literally email us at partners@pronatalist.org, which is distasteful. We will send you a free copy, ebook and audiobook.
That way you don't have to risk any money going to
Pronatalist. We don't want that to happen. That would be
in
bad.
the Toby, you're talking about Toby Ord thing, saying like what a good thing to do in this scenario is find like a mutual like third charity that's neither antinatalist or pronatalist that you can both agree on and put into the pot.
Oh, I thought you were going to say a third one that we would hate.
Oh no, one that you both like.
Well, it sounds like genetic selection technology. So genetic selection technology, that's the one we agree on that everyone else hates.
Please get $1.99 to genetic selection.
Yeah. I don't think there's even any major nonprofits that are advocating for that, which is really a shame.
Sadly, no.
But yeah, anyway, thank you, Malcolm and Simone, and John as well. Any links will be in the description, and thank you for watching.